Chapter 733. Today, this chapter was written slowly. I am very satisfied. Tomorrow, I will talk about why Fancian is like this. Then I will hum ah. I suddenly thought of that sentence in the introduction to The Drunkard's Home. In winter, people wore cheap and warm cotton clothing and sat on the Kong drinking cool and fiery wine. In spring, the water wheels of the Jiang and water villages slowly ran. The seemingly unremarkable water conservancy facilities were silently displaying their effects. In summer, large leaf fans fanned the cool breeze in the homes of the wealthy. All sorts of carriages and ships left the various workshops to deliver goods into the hands of those who needed them. The basic water conservancy facilities throughout the Qing Kingdom's fields, the glass and porcelain in every home, and the atmosphere in every space. They were all related to the palace treasury. The palace treasury was not just the 3 large workshops in North Min. It was spread throughout the entire Qing Kingdom, such as the Shishan bookstore and other fringe industries. The production of the palace treasury was not only related to military equipment and other large industries related to the fate of the country and the people's lives. It also included small things related to the lives of the people. These small things floated to the other end of the ocean and scattered into the world. They appeared unremarkable, but they successfully helped the Qing Kingdom amass a stunning amount of wealth. The palace treasury helped the Qing Kingdom create the equipment and military equipment needed for a mighty army. The warships of the 3 naval divisions also used this endless wealth to support the food and fodder that the Qing Kingdom needed to expand its borders. More importantly, the Qing Emperor needed this wealth to stabilize the people's lives and maintain the effective operation of the court's officialdom system. Perhaps the hundreds of millions of people of the Qing Kingdom had long become accustomed to the palace treasury in their lives, so much so that it had become natural. They had gradually forgotten the importance of the palace treasury, or at least underestimated its importance. The Qing Emperor would not. Any official with a brain in the Qing Kingdom would not. The northern Qi court, which had always drooled over the palace treasury, would even less so. Otherwise, the Qing Kingdom would not have gathered its elites in North Min and set up even tighter security around the 3 workshops than in Jingdou. All of this was to prevent the secrets of the palace treasury's workmanship from leaking out. The fire in the royal palace clearly indicated to the Qing Emperor that the Qing Kingdom's greatest secret was not a secret to Fancian. It was even a bargaining chip that he could play with as he pleased in his hands. Once the palace treasury's processes were completely destroyed, the old craftsman died, and the 3 workshops were destroyed, the foundation of the Qing Kingdom would receive a destructive blow. However, the emperor's cold face showed that he was not worried that the palace treasury would be destroyed by Fancian. He knew that Fancian also cared about the palace treasury and would not tear apart this treasure of the world. He believed that Fancian was acting in Jiangnan right now and destroying the palace treasury's production process. He also believed that before Fancian did these things, he must have already recorded a copy of the production process. As long as it was still useful, it could be used as a bargaining chip. The Qing Emperor coldly withdrew his gaze from the black smoke and glanced at Fancian. "You are indeed insane. As a person of the Qing Kingdom, how could you do such a thing?" Fancian was silent for a moment. He then said, "I just thought that, in the end, this is a matter between you and me. Once disaster spreads to the world, it is truly not what I want." These words were very clear. The emperor controlled the world. If Fancian did not hold enough bargaining chips in his hands that he cared about, how could the emperor's heart be completely restrained and only limit the battle to the royal palace? He had enough methods to deal with the people attached to Fancian. However, Fancian wanted to force the emperor not to act against those people. This seemed to be a very childish request, as if it was just playing house. "Your Majesty, I am about to rebel. If my rebellion fails, please don't make things difficult for my subordinates." There was a death-like silence in the palace. Fancian, who had made this suggestion, and the calm emperor did not treat this as a game. Fancian did indeed have a powerful weapon in his hands that could harm the foundation of the Qing Kingdom. The emperor was not someone who could be threatened. Even if Fan Xian held the most important weapon in the palace treasury in his hands, he glanced at Fan Xian coldly and said, "Continue." Fan Xian bowed with great sincerity and said, "Your Majesty is brimming with talent." Presently, the Qin Kingdom's national treasury is full. The people's morale is usable, and the armored soldiers are brave. Although famous generals have fallen, looking at Yuan, it can be seen that within the ranks, the Qin Kingdom has many talented people. Even if the palace treasury is destroyed in my hands, it will not completely collapse in a short time. Given your Majesty's abilities, no matter how determined the Northern Qi Emperor and Shanhu are to resist, the Qin Kingdom will send an army north and sweep across the lands like tigers and wolves. In your Majesty's lifetime, we will certainly be able to realize our grand wish of unifying the world. No one can stop this process. Even if I hold the most important part of the palace treasury, I have to admit that this cannot threaten you. You can completely ignore all of this. Fan Xian lowered his head and calmly said each word. However, your Majesty's vision is vast. How can it be limited to a moment or a place? He raised his head and calmly looked into the Qing Emperor's eyes. Your Majesty wants to unify the world, build a large empire, end the endless wars on this land, and fight for a peaceful future for millions of people. You want to leave behind the heroic name of an emperor through the ages in the annals of history. Thus, what you seek is for the Qin Kingdom to unify the world for thousands of generations. If you are alive and swallow up Northern Qi and Dongyi, use the power of iron and blood to suppress the resistance, and use your genius and wisdom to win over the hearts of the people, you will be able to confirm the unification of the world. However, what if you die? The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly. There will not be another emperor in the world. Where would the Qin court, which had just swallowed up the world, find another talented ruler? Northern Qi's territory was vast, and it produced talents in large numbers. It inherited the spirit of the Wei Kingdom and had always considered itself to be the rightful ruler. If no one could suppress it, and the millions of foreign people rose up in rebellion, who could stop them? Just based on the Qin Kingdom's mighty armies killing people everywhere, the initially united world would probably sink into the flames of war again. At that time, it would be difficult to say whether or not the Qin Kingdom would be able to guarantee the unification of its territory. I'm afraid that the people would rise up in rebellion. The Qin Kingdom and Jingdo would also be in danger. Your Majesty is well read in the history books. You know that using iron and blood to control people will not last long. There was once a plan for the first emperor to kill everyone under heaven, but in the end, he died in his second life. During these 3 years, thinking of your Majesty's grand plans, you have to rely on the endless flow of the palace treasury to ensure that the central Qin court has an absolute advantage in national power over the newly annexed lands and intimidate the remnant people of the new lands. Using the advantage in national power to exchange for time, using the name of communication to exchange for the power of integration, through many generations, the previous court will be forgotten and the hearts of the new people will return. Only then will there be true unification. However, if the palace treasury is destroyed, who will ensure that the Qin Kingdom will always have an advantage in national power and military power? If you are alive, none of this will fundamentally change. If you are dead and there is no palace treasury, who will maintain the structure of this land? People will always die. Fan Xian calmly looked into the emperor's eyes. Fan Xian looked calmly into the emperor's eyes and said, "Even someone like you cannot escape birth, old age, sickness, and death." Looking at the court's planning these 3 years, you have also been thinking about the future. You are a very confident person and have the right to be confident. You do not think that the Northern Qi Emperor and Shanhu will be able to stand against your determination to sweep through the world, Fan Xian said calmly. Today, even if there is no palace treasury, you will still be able to complete the grand plans you have worked so hard for decades. What you want is not for a world of incomparable glory to blossom, and then for the Qin Kingdom to fall in the storm of resistance. The history books are always written by the victors. After unifying the world, if the Qing kingdom cannot last for tens of thousands of generations, if you are as great as yourself in the annals of history, you will only be able to leave behind a name of ruthlessness and short-sightedness. Fan Xian smiled slightly. You want the Qing kingdom to last for tens of thousands of generations, so you need the palace treasury in my hands. What can you promise me? The emperor suddenly laughed. There was a sense of gratification in his laughter. It was clear that this unfathomable emperor was very happy with his favorite son. Every word and sentence was close to his true feelings that others rarely got close to. It was close to his grand intentions. If I die, the recording of the process will be returned to the court, and the destructive work in Northmen will immediately stop. As you know, I always have some rather loyal subordinates. Fan Xian replied sincerely. He did not say defeat because he had entered the palace alone and turned the royal palace into a battlefield. Whoever lost would die. Where's their second path? As he spoke, Fan Xian turned around and stood side by side with the emperor. He looked at the snowy ground covered in shards of silver among the wild grass in front of him. His gaze fell to his left and said, "Under your majesty's attack, the chief on the grasslands no longer has the power to rise again. However, at the foot of the westernmost mountain, there are still 7,000 man riders who have migrated from the snowy plains. This group of fresh troops is very valiant. If your majesty agrees to my request, I can guarantee that this group of man riders will never come near Shiliang." The emperor's gaze followed his gaze and fell to the remaining snow on his left. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "In the Qingzhou victory, Su beat his court went all out, but they only brought 2,000 or 3,000 man riders. According to Gong Dian's report, the battle power of these man riders is indeed not bad. If the heavens had not been unfair and forcefully granted the snowy plains in the north 3 years of snow disasters, they would not have escaped so far to the western grasslands. Looking at it this way, Shang Shanhu's ability to resist the man at the northern gate for so many years is truly impressive. However, in the end, there are too few of them. They won't be able to affect the situation." The emperor's brows relaxed, and he coldly shook his head. It was clear he was not willing to accept Fan Xian's bargaining chip. We're talking about a matter that will last for thousands of generations. It was clear that Fan Xian's tone was very frivolous. He even said the words "we" in such a rebellious manner. He smiled and said, "There are 7,000 young men, but they are very cultured. There are also many women. Additionally, she who has suffered heavy losses. This group of northern man riders will certainly become an important power on the grasslands. If they want to go to various tribes to capture Hu women, who can stop them? As you know, the Hu people are very fertile. At most, in a decade or two, this tribe will be very impressive. If no one can suppress, control, or guide them, then wouldn't this rising tribe be a second court?" Fan Xian looked at the snow-covered ground to his left and shook his head. "The people of Shiliang Road are very wretched. Are they going to endure for another few decades?" The emperor smiled slightly and said, "I don't understand. Your subordinates in Shiliang Road and the grasslands have been pretty much all killed by me. What power do you still have to influence those man people?" "Songji Xianling," Fan Xian said with a smile. "Although she is the daughter of an old royal family and has a noble status, she doesn't have much practical use in commanding. However, her status is still here. Furthermore, her status is very high on the grasslands. She is also very powerful and can already gather most of the man people's power. As long as you control her, it is the same as controlling these man people. Are you saying that if you can control her, then I can't control her, and the court can't control her?" The emperor asked mockingly. Fan Xian sighed and said, "Songji Xianling is Haitang Duo. She is my woman. Of course, only I can control her." The emperor was slightly startled. After a moment of silence, he finally couldn't resist smiling. He shook his head and didn't say anything more. His gaze landed directly on the southeast corner of the snow-covered ground in front of the two of them. The emperor pointed in that direction and said, You brought back the palace treasury process with both hands. Is there anything else? Jiangnan will not fall into chaos because I have already thrown it into chaos first. The loyalty of your subordinates to you has truly surprised me. However, Xiao Qifei won't be able to jump around for 2 days. Even if Su Wenmao hid people in the palace treasury, he won't be able to do it himself. I have also moved Cheng Jialan back. Rinbo and his brother has also been moved back from the army of the 3 large workshops. The emperor said calmly with his hands behind his back and quietly watched the snow-covered ground without any lines with Fan Xian. Fan Xian's gaze also landed on the southeast corner of the snow-covered ground. He smiled and said, Jiangnan can still fall into chaos. The palace treasury has already agreed to your majesty's request, so I won't go and cause more trouble. Jiangnan thrives on commerce. Including the palace treasury, they collectively support about 40% of the court's taxes. If Jiangnan falls into chaos, how can the court support it? From the beginning of today's conversation, Fan Xian's calm tone carried a sense of carefreeness, nakedness, and fearlessness. This kind of frivolity and fearlessness could truly be said to be like a cold blade. He did not give an inch as he negotiated with the emperor. It had to do with his confidence and his state of mind. Just as he said earlier, he could not find any way to perfectly control it, so he could only choose the simplest method. Because this method was direct, it appeared to have great destructive power. He very straightforwardly asked the emperor, if Jiangnan fell into chaos, how could the court support it? The emperor smiled and straightforwardly countered with a question. If I directly kill all your people, how will Jiangnan fall into chaos? I have Zhaoshang Money House, Fan Xian replied calmly. Jiangnan thrives on commerce. The most fatal part is the exchange of silver in circulation. Zhaoshang Money House has been in Jiangnan for many years and secretly controls some of the businesses of the Ming, Sun, and Xiong families. Once the money house makes a move, it will not be difficult for Jiangnan to fall into chaos. A lot of Zhaoshang's silver has long been moved away. The emperor glanced at Fan Xian with slight mockery and did not directly expose the astonishing amount of silver. He returned to the northern Qi royal family and said, It's just some paper. With a wave of my pen, what does it matter? You can't say it like that. After all, Chuanzhou has not yet achieved its intended use. The transfer of the ocean ships is still handled in Dongyi. Fan Xian did not back down and straightforwardly said, Silver notes and promissory notes are all paper. With a wave of the emperor's pen, they are all invalid. Then, without Zhaoshang Money House doing anything else, Jiangnan will probably fall into chaos first. The emperor did not understand business, and Fan Xian did not understand much about it either. No one had an accurate grasp of just how much Jiangnan's business activities relied on the embryonic and undeveloped financial credit system. Fan Xian believed that everything in the world had its own rules, particularly the business activities that Jiangnan had operated for over 100 years. If the emperor truly did that, Jiangnan would certainly fall into chaos first. The Qing emperor, and he did not understand business, but it did not mean that the officials in court and Fan Xian subordinates did not understand. Before this, they had all done their homework. Fan Xian only knew that a very important part of business was liquid capital. It was like the blood flowing through the veins. If the money house was truly overturned and the blood in the veins dried up, business activities would certainly become abnormally difficult and dry. I have taken Hua Garden back from Yang Jimei's hands, the emperor reminded coldly. This emperor could actually be said to be a truly wise ruler. He did not understand the business operations of Jiangnan, but that did not mean he would rely on the emperor's authority to do things blindly. He left professional matters to professional officials to operate. He knew that Zhaoshang Money House in Fan Xian's hands had the power to shake the Jiangnan business map. Thus, last autumn, when the first chaos rose in Jiangnan, the court was already prepared. In the entire world, the ones with the most silver and the least need to rely on money houses to carry out transactions were the large and small salt merchants in Jiangnan. Yang Jimei, whom the emperor had mentioned earlier, was one of the largest salt merchants in Jiangnan. The court had long been wary of money houses taking silver. By bringing the salt merchants into this system, they had their eyes on the salt merchant stash of real gold and silver from all over the world. Although it would be difficult to reconstruct an exchange system, at least it wouldn't be completely controlled by Fanxian. Just being a salt merchant is not enough, Fanxian said with slightly lowered eyelids. I still have Taiping in my hands. Taiping Money House, the foremost money house in the world. No one knew how many years it had been in business and how many people's daily lives it could affect. This money house had always been in Dongi. Its owner had always been mysterious. No one had ever seen his true appearance. It was not until Fanxian took over as the master of the sword hut in Dongi that he discovered with horror that Taiping Money House had always been under the control of the sword hut and Sigajian. Each time he thought of this, Fanxian couldn't help but feel shock and admiration. He admired Sigu Jian's foresight and insight. Probably only the master of Dongi could discover the importance of a money house in the increasingly prosperous trade and leave behind such a weapon that could shake the world. Hearing the word Taiping, the emperor's eyes narrowed and a cold light flashed. It was clear that, just like when Fanxian first learned of this secret, the emperor also felt a chill. Taiping Money House was left to me by Sigu Jian, Fanxian added quietly. The emperor suddenly laughed. His laughter was filled with absurdity. It was probably because he had suddenly discovered that all of his enemies worthy of respect in this world had given the last method to defeat him to his favorite son. This absurd reality made even this seemingly cold and emotionless emperor's heart waver slightly. Your Majesty, let's look at Dongi again. Fanxian's gaze moved up from the bottom right corner of the snowy land to the center of the lonely snowy land. There was a pile of weeds there. It looked like the East Sea in the summer, full of mountain-like waves that pierced through the sky. The emperor's smile gradually faded. His expression became calm and warm. There is no need to discuss Dongi. However, the dozen kids in the sword hut are a bit troublesome. In the end, they're not a match for an army. A 9th level ace is completely useless in construction. If they want to cause destruction, they're always good at it. For example, they can carry out assassinations and cause destruction in the heart of the Qing kingdom. Fanxian's gaze looked faintly to the right of the snowy land. The emperor and his questions and answers continued. Snowflakes continued to fall in the winter palace. Some landed on the strange father and his son pair. Some landed on the snowy ground in front of them and on the weeds. There were no lines on this vast expanse of snowy land. There were no borders, no separation between snowy mountains and green grasslands. There wasn't even a shape. However, the Qing emperor and Fanxian looked at this silent and cold snowy land and talked about the world. Their gazes fell on the grassland to their left, Dongi to their right, Jiangnan to their right, and Qing's territory to the north. Their gazes fell a little further ahead. Wherever they looked, that was the world. The snowflakes gradually grew larger. Curling and dancing in the air in the broken palace, they gradually accumulated thicker. The green clothes Fanxian wore and the emperor's bright yellow dragon robe began to turn white. The snowy ground in front of the two of them was also covered in a thick layer of snow. There were no longer any traces of grass or land. It was just like the world, a vast expanse of white. It was truly clean. In their eyes, how could it be divided by man? I have the power to make the world fall into chaos. Even if I die now, I can make your Majesty's grand plan become this snow. When the sun rises, it will melt into water, and it will never come true again. Fanxian stuck out his tongue and licked his dry lips. He had spoken too much today. His mouth was dry. Seriously, he said to the emperor, "Thus, I request a fair battle with your Majesty." "What is fair?" the emperor asked with narrowed eyes. "Please, your Majesty, let Ruo out of the palace. I only have this sister." "Please, your Majesty, allow one and my pitiful family to return to Danzhou to live. I only have this family. Please, your Majesty, be lenient and don't carry out a purge after my death. The officials and subordinates loyal to me are actually all useful." Fanxian paused and then smiled bitterly. "If I die, they will no longer have any reason to resist the court. Please, your majesty, believe this. The world had already shrunk into a small piece of snowy land in front of the ruler and official. The battlefield of beacons had become this quiet royal palace. Fancien had done so much and said so much. It seemed that he only wanted to do his best to control the split between father and son to a small area and give those who had been dragged into this matter a way out. Chapter 734. Why? In the wind and snow, Fancien sank into deep thought. He didn't need any time to think. From many years ago, he knew that one day he would receive this question. All these years, he had been preparing and running away, but he had never truly run away. This was a question he had thought about countless times. Even the last 7 days of hard thinking, it was still the same. Why? He slowly raised his head and narrowed his eyes in the snow. Looking at the emperor, he slowly said, "Today, in the Imperial College, I spoke to those young people about the problem of benevolence and righteousness, as well as the problem of true righteousness." Fancien sighed and said with a complicated expression, "In the past, I had thought that all of this was fake and fake. However, after all these years, I have everything an official should have and shouldn't have. Only now do I realize that other than those so-called standards, there is nothing else in the world that can make your life more real." The emperor looked at him lightly. His thin lips opened slightly. In an icy voice, he repeated what Fancien had said in the Imperial College this morning. "I have no regrets. Since ancient times, those with lofty ideals who believe in righteousness under heaven should not be moved by success or failure." Fancien's words to the young people in the Imperial College in the morning clearly made who the scholar feel the murderous intent and determination hidden between the lines. Who the scholar entered the palace in fear and recounted the scene in the Imperial College to the emperor. The emperor was able to recite Fancien's words. Fancien also felt a glimmer of surprise. He smiled bitterly and said, "I'm not the kind of person who sees righteousness as the principle of life. I'm also not a saint whose morals are supreme. In my bones, I am still a person who, other than loving and respecting myself, is nothing. This is probably something hidden in my bones, something that I have hidden and sealed away for over 20 years. Fancien looked at the emperor and said seriously, "I want to live this life to the fullest. I want to live wantonly. I want to live to the fullest and without regrets. Thus, I need to have a clear conscience. If I continue like this, the things buried in my bones will make it impossible for me to have a clear conscience for the rest of my life. The prosperity and power of this world can make one blind and deaf, but I still cannot pretend that I don't know and have never heard of the things that happened back then and what happened this autumn." A faint sorrow rose to Fancien's face. He slowly said, "Chen Pingping returned to the capital to ask the emperor a question, but I don't need to ask. I only know that these things are unfair. Furthermore, this unfairness is inflicted on those who love me and those I love. If there was no me in the world, there would be no me who bravely walked in front of the emperor like today. Where would those people who have already passed go to find fairness? They should not be forgotten by this world. The injustice they have suffered must be redeemed through some method," Fancien said as he looked at the emperor. "This is your responsibility as well as my duty." The emperor heard Fancien's words, which came from his heart, and was silent for a long time. In an icy voice, he slowly asked, "Why don't you ask me what exactly happened back then? Why don't you ask me? Do you think I don't have difficulties?" King Jing's manor, which was King Cheng's manor, still has many memorials that Mother privately wrote to you, Fancien replied after a moment of silence. "I've seen them all. I don't need to ask anything. I know why what happened back then happened. As for whether her death was a good thing or a bad thing for this land and the millions of people, I don't care." He smiled with some difficulty and said, "Your Majesty, this is actually not a debate about the world or justice. This is not a public grudge. This is only a private grudge." "What a private grudge." The emperor also smiled. With his hands behind his back, he stood alone in the wind and snow with an indescribable loneliness. "She was your mother. Am I not your father?" Fancien's body froze slightly. He didn't continue on this topic. Instead, he calmly said, Your Majesty has great ambitions. You're walking on the path you think is correct. In my opinion, no matter how great, glorious, and correct a goal is, if it is done through despicable methods, it is not worthy of respect. A mocking smile rose to the corners of the emperor's lips. Looking at Fan Xian's fearless eyes, he said, "Do you think that killing in Jingdo today is a very glorious method?" Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. "My goal is only to close a case from decades ago and tear away the greatest shadow over my head. Everything is from my own point of view. Just as I said earlier, this is a private grudge. There has never been any great, glorious, or correct meaning. Since it is so, what does it matter how despicable my methods are?" He paused and used a complicated gaze to look at the emperor with a slightly emotional gaze. "In these areas, I'm more like you. For you and me, good person is such an extravagant adjective. However, it is precisely because of this that I am not like her, still confused and baffled until death. At least before I die, I can still ask you one thing." These words spoke of the fundamental difference between Yi Qingmei and Fan Xian. However, the affairs of the world were unpredictable. Miraculously, as Fan Xian rushed about in this world and enjoyed his rise, in the end, he slowly leaned toward Yi Qingmei's path. This pair of souls, who had come into the world one after the other and warmed each other across time, were probably the only existences in this world that did not have a natural reverence for imperial power. Speaking for the innermost part, they both had the desire to stand ramrod straight in front of the throne. The emperor was calm and smiled slightly. He looked at Fan Xian with a strange emotion. No one knew if he felt as if he was seeing that woman again after many years. Facing Fan Xian's seemingly calm but actually piercing sigh, the emperor did not get angry or gloomy. On the contrary, he calmly began to talk about other matters. "Back then, during the Taiping courtyard coup, I did not have high hopes that you would survive." Fan Xian nodded slightly. During the Taiping courtyard bloody incident, Yi Qingmei had just given birth to him and was at her weakest. Furthermore, he was only an infant. How could he have survived the crazed pursuit of the empress's family and the cold surveillance of the Qin family's army? Since the emperor had created this despicable and cold-blooded plan, he had coldly ignored his life and death. If the old Fan family had not risked their lives, if Uncle Wu Zhu had not rushed back quickly, if Chen Pingping had not discovered something was wrong and rushed back from the northern border ahead of time, he would not exist in the present Qin kingdom. In the end, you survived and were sent to my mother. Other than feeling slightly surprised, I cannot deny that I let out a sigh of relief. After all, you are my flesh and blood. The emperor looked at Fan Xian calmly. The emperor gazed at Fan Xian and calmly said, "Now that I think about it, Pingping was already suspicious of me at that time. Otherwise, he would not have agreed to Fifth Brother's request to send you to Danzhou. He knew that in this world, I see the Empress Dowager and my mother as a mother. He could only watch as this became an established reality. If things had continued like this, then it would have been fine. At most, I would have been in Jingdo and you in Danzhou. During the holidays, I would have remembered that I still had an illegitimate child in the distant Danzhou seaside and would have given the Fan Manor a few more rewards to send to your side." The emperor's hair was covered with snowflakes. For a moment, it was impossible to tell if it was snow or snow-like hair. His entire person was gradually taking on a kind of old age. However, Chen Pingping did not seem to think this way. When you were 4, he sent Fei Jie to your side and secretly transferred a group of Overwatch Council spies to my mother to use. He entered the palace to tell me about this matter. I had originally thought that his actions were superfluous. The emperor's brows furrowed. It was as if he was recalling the events of the past dozen years. However, when you were 12, you were attacked by an assassin. The emperor glanced at Fan Xian and shook his head. During those years in Danzhou, presumably you didn't know that news from Danzhou was sent all the way to Chen Pingping's desk through the Overwatch Council. That old cripple took out an even stronger passion than when he was managing council affairs and frequently entered the palace to tell me your every move. You flirted with the serving girls in Danzhou. You climbed onto the rooftops and made a racket. You began to personally cook for my mother. The unusually dangerous tyrannical Jinshi that you cultivated in your body. A strange smile rose to the emperor's face. I knew your every move, even more so than my sons in Jingdo. Thus, although you were far away in Danzhou, I seem to have gotten used to you being by my side. Then, you came to Jingdo and came to my side. In the Qing temple, in the tea shop outside the courtyard. The emperor glanced at Fan Xian. His smile gradually faded. You entered the Overwatch Council. You went to the Hanging Temple. You accompanied me into the little building. You were sent by me to Jiangnan. I have to admit that you are my son, and the one I love the most. Your mother once said that love is a habit. I've gotten used to your existence when you were young. The emperor suddenly raised his head to gaze at the snowy sky. No one knew who he was looking at. He suddenly nodded and said, "However, my favorite son is not willing to be my son. At this time, he is still standing in front of me to challenge my authority and find justice for what happened in the past." He lowered his head and looked at Fan Xian coldly. "There is no victory or defeat between you and me, father and son. Thinking about it carefully until now, in the end, it is still Chun Pingping who has won." Fan Xian understood these words, so he sank into silence. Since you are not a benevolent and righteous person who thinks about the world, since you only seek to resolve a personal grudge and not for justice, then I do not understand your choice today. The emperor did not give Fan Xian more of a feeling that he was more like a relative and directly opened his mouth to question him. Since it was just for a personal grudge, since it was just to seek a straightforward justice, why did Fan Xian earlier treat the snowy ground as the world and lay out the facts and reason with the emperor? Why did he throw out so many bargaining chips just to keep the battle within the royal palace and the enemy side limited to father and son? There was never any kindness to speak of in revenge. The Qing kingdom and the world could all be Fan Xian's weapons. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "I thought about it in the manner for 7 days. He smiled and continued. The so-called seclusion was all a lie. Being locked in a room for 7 days and 7 nights would drive someone crazy. I also wanted to eat and get some air." His expression gradually softened and calmed. Late at night, when and the others were asleep, I would sneak out of the room alone with an unlined garment draped over my shoulders. Like a wandering spirit, I would wander through the manor's garden. During those days, there was continuous snow in Tianjin, and the nights were very cold. The old women who looked after the garden all hid in a corner room to drink. No one noticed me. I just wandered and wandered and wandered alone. Fan Xian looked at the emperor and opened his eyes wide. Very seriously, he said, "Only now did I realize that the Fan Manor's garden was actually so big. Usually, I've been so busy with government affairs and scheming that I almost forgot what my own garden looked like. It was not until these 7 days that I noticed that the Fan Manor's garden was actually larger than Jiangnan's Hua Garden. I don't know how many manors there are on that street in the south of the city and how much space they take up," Fan Xian said seriously. "There is also the food and clothing that are usually unremarkable. In my eyes, they are very common things. In reality, for those common people, they are all luxurious pleasures." He pointed at the royal palace in the snow and said, "Of course, the largest garden is still this royal palace. In the past few years, while I was living my own little life, I also helped out the lives of the common people. Regardless of whether it was the palace treasury, the Riverworks Yamen, or the Hangzhou conference, I have gained some reputation. I had thought that I was helping them, but I suddenly understood that it was actually them providing for us." Fan Xian's expression was calm. Looking at the emperor, he said, "Since that is so, what right do I have to ask for gratitude from them? I am not a saint. I have all kinds of shortcomings. It is just that the better ones these years have been hypocritically hidden. If I ask myself honestly, in the end, I still love the Qing kingdom. No matter how bad this country is, under the emperor's rule, the people live relatively happily. There's the palace treasury and the Overwatch Council. If I don't mess around, at least these good days can be lived for a few more decades. As I said earlier, I'm not even worthy of a heart of gratitude. Then, What right do I have to harm them just because of my own personal grudge? Throwing the world into turmoil, killing and burning everywhere, causing the world to fall apart, and causing them to suffer wretchedly. Would I be happy? If I choose that path for the sake of revenge, putting aside what that old cripple in heaven would think, I think Mother would not be happy. Since I seek justice for them, then how could I choose a path they don't like? I love the Qin kingdom, so I hope that this is only a battle between the Emperor and me. This is only a matter between us. It is best not to drag too many people in. Before, someone said that one should walk the right path in this world. What is the right path? It is doing the right thing. However, I still don't understand. There is right and wrong here and there. How can I use my own right and wrong to judge the Emperor's right and wrong? How can I use my own right and wrong to judge the right and wrong of the world? What is the standard for determining right and wrong? In the end, this can only be a subjective feeling. If the right path is doing the right thing, then the so-called right is the direction that allows one to have a clear conscience. Today, I enter the palace to say and do all this to allow myself to have a clear conscience. Fanxian spoke word by word slowly. He said most of what he had been thinking during these 7 days. As for the remaining small portion, it involved the battle between him and the Emperor. It was not just today, but also a possible future battle. There was no benefit in saying more about this kind of mutual harm and probing. It would only be harmful. There are no true saints in this world. The Emperor lowered his eyelids slightly. A few snowflakes hung on his eyelashes. Perhaps your mother counts as one. What you have said today is at least close to the true meaning of this world. If your mother knew that you had grown into such a young man, presumably she would feel very comforted. Fanxian looked calmly at the Emperor's thin face. Suddenly, for some reason, a wave of sympathy and sorrow that even he was afraid of welled up in the depths of his heart. These inappropriate emotions that appeared at inappropriate times made him feel terrified. Faced with such a snow-capped figure, what was there to sympathize with? Perhaps he sympathized that the Emperor, until now, still saw Fanxian as proud as flesh and blood and had no idea that Fanxian's body had a soul that had long been set in stone. Perhaps Fanxian sympathized that the Emperor had been kept in the dark by his acting skills. Even at the moment of life and death, Fanxian still could not reveal his true feelings. During these years, Fanxian had played the role of a loyal official and filial son in front of the Emperor. Even though he had slaughtered his way through Jingdo and entered the palace to face the reprimand, he still played the role of a pure, honest, and solemn one. Using his words as the edge and his performance as the blade, he had, step by step, pierced into the Emperor's heart. This was a battle of the heart. Back then, Fanxian had wanted to deal with the northern Qi Saint girl, Haiding Duo. He had begun his preparations in Jingdo, swayed in the North Sea, pretended to be drunk in a restaurant in Shangjing, shook and shook until they were together. Then there was that touch of gentleness in Jiangnan. Finally, he had truly won this battle. The Emperor was not Haiding. Fanxian had acted longer in front of him and had worked harder. He didn't know if he could truly move the Emperor's heart that would not be melted by wind and snow. However, this act was destined to continue. Even if Fanxian died to the Emperor's hand, it had to continue. If he didn't do this, he could not pull this person down from the altar and the throne. If he didn't do this, he could not protect the people Fanxian wanted to protect. The barefooted was not afraid of those wearing shoes. For Fanxian to be so shameless and black-hearted to such an extent, to use killing against killing, the Qin Emperor was not an opponent that could be defeated so easily. Fanxian was cold-blooded enough, but the Emperor was even more cold-blooded. Thus, the cold-blooded killing that could be seen today was all a foreshadowing and prelude. The true curtains were about to be pulled open. The wind and snow no longer swirled in the air. Instead, they fell straight down, turning from little flower buds into goose feathers. With a heavy sense of beauty, they landed on the Emperor and Fanxian's bodies. They walked from the Hall of Governmental Affairs to the depths of the palace. After a long conversation, the junshi of the two circulations of different natures in Fanxian's body had long been nurtured. His entire body had entered a realm without joy or sorrow. The Jinshi in his body was abundant to the extreme. He was only waiting for a snowflake to touch that moment. In the wind and snow, the Qing Emperor stood with his hands behind his back. His body carried a natural and unparalleled might. He narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at Fan Xian with a mocking smile. Fan Xian had long used the power of the wind and snow to release his power. Once it touched the area around the emperor's body, it was as if it had run into an indestructible snowy mountain. It was unable to advance another step. The realm of a great grandmaster was not something mortals could touch. The Qing Emperor only looked at Fan Xian coldly and indifferently. Wherever his gaze reached, Fan Xian was pressed into the snowy ground. Ruler and subject, father and son, faced each other for a long time. The emperor suddenly smiled mockingly. Even if I want to help you feel at ease, it will take time. After saying this, the emperor put his hands behind his back. Raising his leg, he walked out with a single step. Walking out, in the wind and snow filled with two waves of tyrannical and powerful Jinshi, the emperor left as he pleased. He did not care at all and was free and at ease. It was as if the current situation and the wild dance of the wind and snow could not stop his steps. This step appeared simple. In reality, it had a deep meaning and was not simple at all. Countless cracking sounds rang out clearly amidst the howling wind and snow. Fan Xian's feet, which were standing on top of the snow, suddenly sank an inch without reason. With Fan Xian's feet as the center, countless thin cracks stretched out like lightning. However, they did not fade for a long time. Left on the snow, they were like spiderwebs. Although they were in the wind and snow, they did not break easily. These thin cracks extended far and wide, and actually clearly revealed the black soil underneath. It looked like an indescribable rune that had a wonderful sense of beauty. Fan Xian stood alone in the middle of these cracks. He was silent for a long time. His expression was calm and cold. He had exerted all his power, but he could not stop the emperor from taking a single step. With that step, the emperor easily walked out. It was as if he was no longer in this world. He suddenly thought of Uncle Wu Zhu's words on the cliff in Danzhou. Take off your clothes and go. The emperor's step earlier had already perfectly reached the perfect realm of this saying. Not only had he thrown away his broken body, he had long walked out of this place. However, Fan Xian did not feel any despair or disappointment. He knew that he was facing the only great grandmaster left in this land. He was already someone who was about to surpass the realm of mortals. He thought for a moment in the snow. He then raised his knees and walked toward the little building, following the footprints the emperor had left behind. Chapter 735. I heard that some friends don't like the dialogue in these chapters. I'm sorry. The beginning of this chapter is still dialogue. I won't stop until the words between the Qing Emperor and Fan Xian are all said and done. I've written this story for a year and a half. Isn't it just for this to be said and done at the end? Oh, right. After reading this chapter, give me some monthly votes. It was really hard to write. This is not a lie. If I drag it out, unless I want to drag myself to death. At night, the little building was brightly lit. Numerous eunuchs and serving girls surged in from all over the abandoned garden like magic. All kinds of dishes, fruit trays, and pots flowed into the pavilion. The emperor and Fan Xian chatted happily as they ate and chatted downstairs. That woman, the woman who stood between the emperor and Fan Xian in the history of the Qin kingdom, sat quietly on a piece of paper in the room on the second floor, watching everything calmly. What should have been the beginning of a battle had become the last dinner between father and son. Fan Xian knew this and accepted it. A battle between two people could not be fought by one person. Since he had already endured for so long before making such a brave and ruthless decision, what difference would another night make? More importantly, it was just as the emperor had said earlier when he easily broke through the situation and left. Since this was a battle between two people, then there had to be some time left for the emperor to do what he had already tacitly agreed to Fan Xian. Would one night be enough time? Your Majesty, Ruo has come to bid farewell to you. Eunuch Yao said respectfully with his head lowered as he stood below the little table. Let her come in. The emperor smiled slightly and glanced at Fan Xian, meaning to say, naturally, I will do what I promised you. A slightly cold wind swirled the snowflakes into the building. A woman like ice and snow entered with the wind. Her steps were steady, and her expression was calm and unchanging. She bowed slightly in front of the emperor. It was Fan Roro. After bidding farewell to the emperor, this woman, who had been under house arrest in the palace for many months, slowly turned around and looked calmly at her brother. Gradually, a faint moisture appeared in her eyes. Fan Xian stood and smiled slightly as he shook his head. Don't cry. Fan Roro did not hide it. She firmly bit her lip and forced a smile. Brother, long time no see. It had indeed been a long time. Ever since Fan Xian had gone to Dongi, the two of them had not seen each other. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, he had only seen that early autumn rain. At that time, Fan Roro had already been under house arrest deep in the palace as a hostage. Fan Xian walked forward and gently wrapped his arm around his sister's thin shoulder. He hugged her and said quietly by her ear, be good in the future and show more filial respect to father and mother. As he said these words, Fan Xian felt that time had turned back. The icy woman in front of him seemed to be a little girl who could not even speak clearly in Danzhou many years ago. Fan Roro made a sound of assent and then left. She knew why the emperor had allowed her to enter the palace today. It must be because her brother and the emperor had reached some kind of agreement. She trusted her brother's teachings and arrangements the most in her life. She did not have any doubts. She only calmly and silently accepted all of this. The emperor and Fan Xian paused at the same time. It seemed that they had not expected the third prince to appear here at this time. They also did not expect that Shufang Palace would not be able to stop this youth. The third prince walked into the building and bowed toward the emperor and Fan Xian. In a muffled voice, he said, Greetings, father. Greetings, sir. Miraculously, the third prince turned and left after saying these words, not caring about any etiquette or rules at all. He left the emperor and Fan Xian, who had sunk into silence. The two of them had seen clearly the third prince's expression earlier. They both saw that the rims of his eyes were already red. Presumably, he had already cried outside the building. The emperor looked at the empty ground. After a moment of silence, he suddenly smiled with a complicated expression. There was a faint sense of loss, but there was also a glimmer of admiration that could not be hidden. The emperor looked at the empty ground. After a moment of silence, he suddenly smiled with a complicated expression. There was a faint sense of loss, but there was also a glimmer of admiration that could not be hidden. Li Chongping had come to this little building to see Fan Xian off. This kind of affection and courage was very much in line with the emperor's personality. Not bad, right? Fan Xian asked. You've taught them well. That's what I've always admired about you. I've never seen you treat them well, but regardless of whether it's the officials in the court, your subordinates, or even my sons, they all seem to be willing to stand on your side, the emperor said. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then replied, That is probably because I have always treated them equally. Eunuch Yao walked into the little building for the third time. Calmly, he said, Someone outside the palace has delivered the manuscript that Sir Fan Jr. needs, and a sword. The sword was the Wei Emperor's sword. It was quietly placed on the table in front of Fan Xian. The manuscript was a list of the He faction's crimes written by former members of the Overwatch Council. It was to be used by the emperor to announce edicts in the future. Eunuch Yao stood in front of the emperor and calmly described what had happened outside the palace. The internal court had a number of spies in Jingdou. There was no need to make any special inquiries to know about the chaos that had been stirred up in Jingdou. The imperial censorites were kneeling in the snow outside the palace and crying endlessly, asking the emperor to severely punish this heinous criminal. Fan Xian was not a homicidal maniac. The lives that had died in Jingdou were all the backbone of the He faction. As for the pedantic imperial censors, they were still alive and well. Other than these imperial censors, the civil officials of the various ministries and temples in Jingdou also began to communicate in secret preparing to exert pressure on the palace. All of this was because the court system had been shaken by the massacre that happened today and felt boundless terror, so they had to stand out. Fan Xian entered the royal palace through the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Many court officials were waiting outside the royal palace. They were waiting for the emperor's edict. A day had passed, and it was already nightfall. The royal palace was still silent. The officials began to feel angry and afraid. Did the emperor still think of the relationship between father and son and not punish Fan Xian after he had done so many heinous and bloody things? It was precisely because of the peace in the palace and the worry of the ministers that the imperial censors once again kowtowed outside the palace. The wind and rain were coming, and the pressure was great. The mountains were about to collapse, and the lakes were about to surge. Eunuch Yao's report did not change the atmosphere in the little building at all. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or Fan Xian, neither cared about the pressure of the court officials. Furthermore, after tonight, one of the father and son would have to give some sort of explanation to the world. The emperor smiled and raised a cup of wine to slowly drink. He then brought up a topic that the two of them had not touched on before. If you die and stay behind, will you be able to control the group of madmen under your command? If you can't, why did I promise to let them live? Because you have to gamble that my words can control them. Otherwise, if the world falls into chaos, it will not be a scene you want to see. The emperor's finger gently spun the wine cup. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "Are you not worried that if I kill you, I won't do what I promised you?" Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. After a moment of silence, he calmly said, "The emperor's words cannot be taken back by 4 horses. 4 horses, not 1 horse." The emperor smiled and said, "It's 4 horses. Your mother said this strange phrase in the past, so I remember it. I just didn't think you would also know." The emperor then sighed and said, "In today's world, if the person I was facing was not you, but your mother, no matter what, I would not give her the right to a fair battle." Fan Xian said mockingly, "Back then, you indeed did not give her any fairness to speak of." The emperor shook his head and coldly said, "I did not give her such a right because I knew she would never use the world to threaten me. Using the world as a bargaining chip is throwing all the people in the world into the casino. She was unwilling to do so, but I was willing to do so. I was willing to use the lives and deaths of the people in the world to threaten you." Fan Xian replied calmly, "This is the difference I spoke of earlier." The emperor shook his head again and said, "That is why I still do not understand. Since you love this country and care for the people in the world, how can you use this to threaten me? First, I have to love the people by my side. Furthermore, I have always been shameless and afraid of death. If I am truly forced to a dead end, of course, this dead end does not just refer to me. I do not mind dragging the entire world and your majesty's lofty aspirations down with me." Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "Actually, I have been waiting for someone this entire time. However, that person never comes back. I have no choice but to risk my life myself." The words, "risk my life," were spoken with a wretched and helpless tone. However, the emperor's eyes gradually lit up. He knew who Fan Xian was waiting for. In the emperor's view, in the present world, only that person could threaten his life and rule. Ever since the bloody case in Taiping courtyard many years ago, he had always been faintly wary of that person's existence. He had even sent the last emissary the temple had sent to the alley beside Fan Manor. Even so, Wu Zhu still did not die. He won't come back. The light in the emperor's eyes gradually faded. Slowly, he said, "It's been 3 years. If he wants to find out who he is, he can only go to the temple. If he truly returns to the temple, how can he come out again?" Fan Xian nodded and accepted this reality with some sorrow. If Uncle Wu Zhu was still connected to this land, he would not be so passive in front of the emperor to the point of threatening to take him down with him. "Back then, how did you make the temple stand behind you?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the emperor. This was one of the great questions in his heart. "I have never been to the temple. After spending a long time with your mother, I know that the temple is actually a place that is gradually declining and desolate. The temple has never cared about the affairs of the world. This is true. A mocking smile rose to the corners of the emperor's lips. However, the temple has always quietly influenced this land. Unfortunately, I am a person of the world. They cannot do anything to me. However, your mother and Lao Wu are people of the temple. This small difference is enough. I know how to use it. Fan Xian sighed and shook his head. He couldn't help but admire the emperor's powerful will. The temple that everyone in the world worshipped, in the end, was nothing more than a sharper knife in the emperor's eyes. During the northern expedition, the meridians in my body were all shattered. I couldn't move a finger. My eyes couldn't see, my ears couldn't hear, and my nose couldn't smell. I was like a dead person. However, my soul was hidden in that broken shell, unable to escape and unable to be free. The emperor suddenly began to coldly narrate the events of the past. It was like enduring the torment of loneliness in the endless darkness. This kind of pain strengthened my resolve. Following the emperor's narration, the lights in the little building dimmed. It was as if they were about to sink into an inescapable sea of darkness. Other than myself and the loneliness I can experience, nothing is real, the emperor said. Other than myself, I don't trust anyone else. In order to achieve my goal, I don't need family or friends. When I woke up in the darkness, the first people I saw were Chun Pingping and Ning Er. The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly. Thus, I trusted them the most. You don't have to worry about Ning Er's safety. However, I had not thought that Qin Pingping would betray me. The emperor's eyes narrowed even more. A cold light shone through them. His tone was faintly angry and sorrowful. Mockingly, he said, I trusted the wrong person, and it led to the situation today. You have never experienced the pain of waking up in the darkness, so you don't understand what I am saying. I have experienced it before. Fan Xian shook his head. He would not explain. It was a long, long time ago when he had encountered a change in that world. However, I have not become like you. My personality just decides my fate. He suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, If Yu Qingmei had not appeared in this world, what would it be like now, Your Majesty? Would it be a bit more beautiful? The emperor's eyes gradually grew icy as he stared at Fan Xian's face. A glimmer of anger appeared and was immediately hidden. Coldly, he said, Let's not talk about what the Qing kingdom would be like without your mother. You only need to remember that back then, the Wei kingdom was at its peak of decay. Not to mention not being able to compare to the Qing kingdom under my rule. It was a far cry from the present northern Qi. Although the Wei kingdom was rotten back then, it was still a colossus. When your mother came to this world, she at least smashed that mountain to pieces. Why is it that none of the former Wei kingdom's people miss the previous dynasty? Why is it that in the thousands of li of land I have conquered, there has never been anyone who cares about the former country and rebelled? The emperor smiled coldly. Think about it yourself. Fan Xian smiled and said, I can't be bothered to think about it. My parents were both remarkable figures. For me, as a son, it is not a very glorious thing. The emperor finally laughed aloud. The two of them continued to eat, drink, and chat. His father and son, ruler and official, were actually very similar. They were both cold and emotionless. However, they had different opinions about the world, the past, and the present. They had different opinions about everything. However, this did not affect the trust and respect the two of them had shown each other these years and firmly occupied the peak of the world. They listened to the wind and snow all night in the little building. This was their last dinner, their last long conversation. Deep into the night, the two of them sat on two chairs under the light of the lantern and began to meditate and rest. Even the true qi that flowed through their bodies was so harmonious. Other than being domineering, each of them had a kind of power that could tear everything apart. When combined, they were actually so harmonious. Without realizing it, the sky brightened. The morning sun came out. The snow outside stopped, and the wind stopped. The thick layer of snow on the ground was like a woolen blanket. It reflected the clear light from the sky and lit up the large abandoned garden in the northwest corner of the royal palace particularly brightly. Fan Xian woke up and sighed in his heart. Standing up, he picked up the sword of the Wei Emperor on the table with his right hand and walked to the door of the little building. He then turned around and calmly looked at the Emperor in the chair. The Emperor slowly opened his eyes. His pupils were unusually clear and bright, unusually calm and cold. There was no longer a glimmer of emotion that a mortal should have. Everything that needed to be said had been said. From this moment on, there was no longer a shred of familial affection between the two of them. Fan Xian raised his right arm, from his shoulder to his elbow to his wrist, and then to the hilt of the sword that he held steadily in his right hand. That unshakable and terrifyingly steady tip of the sword pointed directly at the Emperor's face. The sword was still in its sheath, but it began to make the cry of a dragon. It hummed and hummed, like the strings in Qin Garden playing. Thick tyrannical jinshi flowed into the body of the sword along the web between Fan Xian's thumb and index finger. It was as if it wanted to bring the sword to life. A glimmer of light that was faintly visible to the naked eye began to spread through the cracks in the sheath. The body of the sword struggled desperately in the sheath. It wanted to break out of the sheath, but could not find a way out. The pain and suffering made one's heart palpitate just by hearing it. Fan Xian didn't know how much jinshi he had poured into it to construct such a shocking scene. The Emperor's pupils constricted slightly. His hands remained on the chair, and he did not rise. However, the only remaining great grandmaster in the world discovered that his favorite son was more powerful than he had expected. In a cold winter day, a drop of sweat fell from the tip of Fan Xian's brow. His delicate face was filled with a heavy and unswerving determination. He had accumulated power for a long time, but the Qing Emperor had not acted. He could not wait forever. The sword he held in his hand was almost out of control. With a light clap, Fan Xian's right foot took a step back and landed heavily on the doorstep. The sword he had stabbed out with his right hand in the form of the burning sky had finally exploded out. The white light in the gap of the scabbard in his hand suddenly disappeared. There was no sound in the small building. That scabbard could no longer withstand the anger of the Emperor's sword inside the scabbard. It struggled, clashed, and silently and strangely, like an arrow, pierced towards the Emperor's face. Fan Xian's first strike was the sword sheath. The sword sheath was imbued with his 7 days of hard thought, the accumulated power of a long night of talking, and thick tyrannical jinshi. In an instant it shot out. Its speed made the sword sheath, like Yin Xiaoyi's arrow in the past, easily tear through the air and surpass the limits of time. In an instant, in the blink of an eye, it arrived in front of the Emperor's eyes. At this moment, a hand appeared in the air. It was an incomparably stable hand. It was a hand that had shaken the wind and rain on Dong Mountain and had a layer of calluses on its middle finger because it had gripped the imperial brush for too long. This hand caught the sword sheath like catching a firefly in the flickering light or a speck of dust in thousands of snowflakes. This hand was too fast. It was fast enough to catch light and fast enough to catch shadows. How could it not catch the sword sheath, which had form and substance? The calmness of the little building was immediately broken. The dragon's cry and humming from the sword sheath rang out again, but it suddenly stopped. Fan Xian's sword sheath, which had been accumulating power for a long time, was like a huge dragon that had its throat grabbed by someone. It stopped breathing and hung its head dejectedly and powerlessly as it lay in the Emperor's palm with its last breath. The Emperor slowly rose. His expression was unusually calm. However, he had to admit that Fan Xian's realm had exceeded his expectations. This strike, which was like a flying dragon from beyond the heavens, seemed to faintly have the feeling of leaving space. There was no one in front of the little building. The Emperor looked coldly in that direction. The chair behind him shattered with a rustling sound, turning into powder, and nothingness, scattering all over the ground. Fan Xian had used all the power in his body to activate the sword sheath. It looked like he had staked everything on one throw. There were no spectators around the little building, so no one expected that after that moment, his body would float up at an even faster speed, sweep up, and fly up. His body was like a large bird. No, He was lighter and faster than a bird. He was like a snowflake swept up by the howling wind. With a speed that was impossible for a human to reach, he suddenly floated a distance of 150 feet from the door of the little building. Snowflakes began to fall from the sky again. In the process of flying, Fan Xian almost stopped breathing. He only relied on the book of spells Ku he left behind before he died to feel the coldness around him in the flow of air. Going with the flow, he floated forward. As he floated, he had time to think. There was a distance of 12 feet from the Emperor's chair to the outside of the little building. The Emperor had to catch his strike and think. Presumably, he would not come out too quickly. The four great grandmasters had already transcended mortality and transcended sainthood. In the end, they were not immortals. They each had their own weaknesses. Master Ku He's weakest point was his old physical body. Yi Liuyun's strongest point was his cloud-like movements. If the great grandmaster in the little building was Yi Liyun, Fan Xian would not have had the extravagant hope of keeping him in the building. However, the person in the building was the Emperor. His Jinshi cultivation was the best in the world. It was abundant to the peak. Relying on Jinshi to move, the physical body would always be limited. Moving in a small area required supernatural skills, just like how Yi Liyun faced a sky full of crossbow bolts. However, the Emperor might not be able to forcefully sweep out of the little building in such a short time. What followed immediately was an attack without any gaps. Fan Xian's feet slid 2 feet on the snowy ground, revealing 2 snow ditches. His figure landed on the snowy ground. Sword light flashed, and he held it horizontally in front of his face. His front knees were in a half-crouch. It was a posture for a fatal attack. At the same time, the cold sword light illuminated his delicate face. A sudden, vigorous, and rapidly burning fire swallowed the entire little building in an instant. A sea of fire appeared in the snowy palace. With a few muffled sounds, countless tongues of flame shot into the sky and surrounded the entire little building. The red and burning light immediately warmed the cold sword in front of Fan Xian and made it red. Such a large and quickly lit fire could not have been formed naturally. No one knew what Fan Xian had prepared in the little building. What made Fan Xian feel slightly disappointed was that a streak of aura flowed through the sea of fire. A human figure stood brilliantly in front of the sea of fire, looking coldly at him. He stood in the snowy ground, leaving the sea of fire behind him. Some places on the Emperor's dragon robe were already charred. His hair was also slightly burnt. His face was slightly pale, but he still stood arrogantly and looked coldly at Fan Xian. When did you move the gunpowder of the third bureau into the palace? The Emperor narrowed his eyes and looked at Fan Xian. Fan Xian smiled widely and gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. 3 years ago, during the Jingdo Rebellion, when I was regent, it was not difficult to move as much gunpowder as I wanted into the palace. The Emperor slowly walked closer to Fan Xian. His eyes narrowed slightly. In a cold voice, he said, "So, for today, you prepared for 3 whole years." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes like the Emperor to prevent the bright sea of fire from affecting his line of sight. Pressing his lips together, he said, "I just thought that if my mother's portrait was placed in this building, presumably she would also feel angry. Since that is the case, then it would be better to burn it." If the Emperor had not summoned Fan Xian in front of the little building yesterday, if the Emperor had not acted immediately and instead had a long conversation with Fan Xian in the little building, Fan Xian would not have been able to find any opportunity to activate the mechanism or ignite the gunpowder. Fan Xian would not have been able to find any opportunity to activate the mechanism or ignite the gunpowder. Up until the moment Fan Xian broke the door sill, Fan Xian had full confidence that the Emperor would choose this little building in the abandoned garden as the final battlefield. There was a portrait of Yi Qingmei on the little building. The Emperor would certainly choose to completely end the decades of gratitude and grudges between them in front of this woman's portrait. Fan Xian was certain of this because he knew the Emperor's intentions better than anyone else in the world. He knew what kind of person the Emperor was. The Emperor was a cold and emotionless, but hypocritical person who thought he was kind and affectionate. Fancian was also very hypocritical. Using the words of that world, the father and son both liked to pretend to be a little bourgeois. Without question, the little building was the best stage for the two of them in this great show. The moment the fire ignited, Fancian's heart jumped. The reason he had chosen the gunpowder that had been buried for 3 years as his ultimate weapon was because Chun Pingping's wheelchair in the royal study had given him confidence. Faced with an attack that came from all directions and had no space to dodge, even a great grandmaster would not be able to create something from nothing and find a way to dodge. The iron pellets and steel balls shot out by the gun in the chair were like this. Presumably, the fire raging everywhere was also like this. Unfortunately, the emperor was still standing in the snow. Although his face had been slightly pale earlier, presumably because he had escaped from the sea of fire and expended a great deal of his yuan qi, this sky-burning fire did not cause him any irreversible injuries. "The fire is too slow," the emperor said without a trace of emotion as he looked coldly at Fancian. Chapter 736. Since he had already made his move, there was no reason for him to use a golden basin to wash his hands. Fancian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. There was not a single stray thought in his mind. It was all exuberant fighting spirit in a state that had been pushed to its peak. With the Wei Emperor's sword in hand, he might not have the world, but at least he had the ambition to charge into the world. In Fancian's eyes, the unfathomable great Grandmaster Emperor in front of him was the world. Heavy snow as thick as goose feathers fluttered down in the palace. Suddenly, 4 streaks of sword light lit up the gloomy world. 4 unpredictable and strange marks appeared in the air. In each mark, there was a frightening sword light. It was impossible to tell which of the 4 strikes would come first and which would come last. Unlike the killing intent contained in the 4 streaks of sword light, the power of the sword flew out to its heart's content and mixed with the wind and snow. It was indescribably wondrous and landed somewhere unknown. In the blink of an eye, Fancian had already floated in front of the emperor. The clothes on his right arm fluttered. Every muscle under his shirt exploded with a shocking power. In a flash, he drew his sword and pulled it back, stabbing out 4 times in a row. The 4 streaks of sword intent arrived through the air. Each strike pierced through a snowflake floating in the air. Then it pierced the side of the emperor's hair, sleeves, in front of the emperor's shoes, and outside the dragon robe. They all missed. In an instant, the 4 strikes all missed. The last strike was only an inch away from the emperor's lower abdomen. However, this inch of distance seemed to be separated by thousands of rivers and mountains. The power of the sword had been exhausted. Like a waterfall that had dried up, it could no longer surge or come closer. The emperor waved his wide sleeves. In front of the 4 strikes that lit up the gloomy palace in winter, he danced freely and easily on the snowy ground. Lightly and skillfully, he avoided the 4 strikes that Fancian had built up power for a long time and released like lightning. It was not Siga Jian, who only cared about the front and not the back. The 4 strikes Fancian struck out in an instant carried an aura of Tianyi Dao's closeness to heaven and earth. Thus, under the cover of the wind and snow, he borrowed the momentum of the snowflakes to move as fast as lightning and as smooth as drifting snow toward the Qing emperor's body. It forced the emperor to not immediately launch a lightning-like counterattack. These 4 streaks of sword aura did not have a sliver of the cold-blooded killing intent of Dong Yi's sword hut. On the contrary, it made one feel closer and gave Fancian the opportunity to get close. However, these 4 strikes, which deeply grasped the exquisite aura of Tianyi Dao, still did not cause any harm to the emperor. In fact, he did not even take a step back. He continued to stand steadily and coldly where he was, as if he had not moved earlier. The cultivation realm of a great grandmaster was indeed not a level that normal people could touch. In front of these 4 swords that borrowed the power of heaven and earth to escape, the emperor had easily neutralized them. The tip of the Wei Emperor's sword hummed and trembled endlessly in front of the bright yellow dragon robe. It was as if it felt a kind of hopelessness and defeat. It wanted to lower its head and accept its fate, but it was also unwilling. It struggled with all its might. The 4 snowflakes pierced through the body of the sword also began to show signs of dispersing. Unlike the sword in his hand, there was not a trace of disappointment on Fan Xian's face. His expression remained calm. The light in his eyes suddenly faded and turned into a deathly stillness. It was emotionless and emotionless. There was only a murderous intent. His eyes were like Sigu Jian's murderous intent soaring to the heavens, piercing through the large trees and reaching the sky. There was not a trace of emotion. There was only coldness. The sword in his hand also became a dead object at this moment. It was a lethal weapon that could not be used by anyone who was not a sage. A deathly chill turned the 4 snowflakes on the sword into a layer of frost in the blink of an eye, solidifying like a mirror. The clothing on his right shoulder suddenly tore. A series of crackling sounds rang out. The 2 circulations in Fan Xian's body moved quickly, clashing and struggling with each other. They broke through the acupuncture point in the shoulder, went through the Yangming meridian, and went straight to the elbow, pressing against the wrist and then to the hilt of the sword. His right arm seemed to have been flung out violently. He used the power of the coffin breaker to move the sword. The sword, which had been at the end of its tether, suddenly grew a foot and pierced directly toward the Qing Emperor's dragon robe. This was the true strike, the strike Sigu Jian had bestowed upon Fan Xian before his death. Merciless and unfeeling, ruthless and without return. One glance was enough to topple a city. Another glance was enough to topple a country. 3 glances were enough to topple a person's heart. Sigu Jian frequently plotted against the world. Even if he did not do it for the world, he would still kill the emperor. Wind and snow rose in the cold palace. The Wei Emperor's sword also became a sword of snow. It was extremely cold and decisive. It left no path of retreat or chance of turning around. It pierced forward with an indomitable will. A heart-palpitating scraping sound rang out. It only rang out for an instant. In Fan Xian's ears, it seemed to ring out for countless years. It was very long and finally stopped. 2 well-maintained, white, and jade-like fingers steadily and coldly clamped down on the Wei Emperor's sword. The scraping sound was the sound produced by the icy blade of the sword and these 2 fingers. The frost on half of the blade had already been removed by the fingers. At this moment, these 2 fingers were clamped between the blade of the sword. A faint hot mist rose from the 2 fingers. Even though the emperor was a great grandmaster, he would not underestimate Fan Xian's strike. This strike was too cold and bloodthirsty. The blade of the sword broke through his 2 fingers and forcefully advanced half the length of the blade. In the end, the emperor took a step back. However, there was still an inch of distance between his body and the tip of the Wei Emperor's sword. Fan Xian was still unable to break through this inch and truly touch the emperor's dragon robe. The emperor looked coldly at his son, who was inches away from him. Some frost had formed on the beard on his chin. He looked particularly terrifying. The knuckles of the 2 fingers that gripped the sword of the Wei Emperor turned slightly white. It was extremely majestic. A powerful and tyrannical Jinshi, like 1,000 lakes, 1,000 rivers, and 1,000 rivers surged out from these 2 fingers. With a gentle twist, the extremely sharp Wei Emperor's sword began to bend like a noodle between the emperor's fingers. However, the Wei Emperor's sword was, after all, the most precious treasure of the royal family. Even under such a terrifying grandmaster suppression, it still did not break. Fan Xian was very close to the emperor. He maintained a posture of a small lunge. His right leg pulled back slightly and crouched low. His entire body maintained a perfect line and did not reveal any openings. It gave one the feeling that it was impossible to attack. However, he held the sword of the Wei Emperor in his hand. In the end, he was not Sigu Jian. This sword was not his own. Rather, it was connected to his body. At this moment, it was like a beautiful character that had suddenly been left with a very flawed stroke. Like a great river, a wild Jinshi surged out from the Wei Emperor's sword. Fresh blood sprayed from the webbing between Fan Xian's thumb and index finger, but he did not pull back his sword. He knew that the first battle now was willpower. His power could not be taken away by the enemy. The coldness in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. The jinqi in his body also began to surge out violently. Fan Xian bravely did not pull back his sword. However, the emperor pulled back his finger. The Wei Emperor's sword, which had been bent to the extreme, bounced up like lightning. Like a whip of a horse, it chopped toward Fan Xian's face. Fan Xian could clearly see the bright sword light in his eyes. The ice and frost on the other half of the sword also split open with this bounce and exploded on the blade of the Wei Emperor's sword. It turned into countless tiny shards of ice and exploded between the emperor and Fan Xian. Fan Xian let out a sharp cry and quickly loosened the webbing between his thumb and index finger. His wrist dropped like lightning, and he held the hilt of the sword in a reverse grip. His feet took a series of 8 steps on the snowy ground. Kicking the golden eaves, he raised his head to retreat. However, with this raise of his head, the perfect and ruthless defense he had woven earlier immediately melted like ice and snow. His movements became a mess. The emperor's figure whizzed forward like a gust of wind, heading straight for Fan Xian's body. A normal and simple punch flew out and landed directly on Fan Xian's chest. With a muffled thud, Fan Xian's body was sent flying by this seemingly light punch. His entire body became a snowflake floating in the air. Drifting in spirals, it was wretched and wretched. Without any strength, it changed countless times in the air. Flipping 7 or 8 times, it swept across dozens of feet of the abandoned garden and snowy ground. In the end, it landed wretchedly on the snowy ground far away. It sent up a large patch of snow and crushed dozens of dead grass. Fan Xian held his chest and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. However, he still stood resolutely and stared fixedly at the emperor in the distance. No one could fly dozens of feet in the air for no reason. Even if they were hit by the emperor's way of the king's killing fist, which was so powerful that they could not form any thoughts of resistance, it was impossible to send a person flying dozens of feet horizontally. The human body was important. After all, it could not be a true snowflake. On Dong Mountain, even though Siga Jian had been sent flying by the Qing Emperor's punch, Siga Jian had rolled out of the Qing temple in Dong Mountain like a stone and wretchedly crashed into that bell. Who could be like Fan Xian earlier and fly so far in the air? It was truly like a snowflake. The emperor glanced coldly at the official's boot in his hand. He looked at the cold, reflective metal tip sticking out of the tip of the boot and furrowed his brows slightly. Earlier, when he had punched Fan Xian in the chest and sent him flying, Fan Xian still had the intention of exchanging a life for a life. He had sinisterly kicked out from under his clothes. The tip of his foot was this metal tip. It was clearly poisoned. The emperor threw the boot into the snowy ground. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at Fan Xian, who was standing with difficulty in the distance. Small tricks cannot accomplish great things. Fan Xian coughed and coughed up blood. With some difficulty, he took out a thin piece of steel from the chest area of his clothes and threw it into the snow by his feet. But small tricks can save a life. A handprint had already appeared on the thin piece of steel. Strangely, it was not the emperor's fist print. Instead, it was the print on the back of a horizontal palm. When the emperor's way of the emperor's punch was about to land on Fan Xian's chest, other than Fan Xian's sinister kick from under his clothes, his left arm naturally slid through the wind and snow and landed in front of his body at lightning speed, protecting in front of his vitals. However, how could his coffin breaker release be a match for His Majesty's punch of the Way of the King, which had the strength of a grandmaster? It was easily broken through the seal, and His Majesty's fist pressed against his palm. In the end, it still fiercely hit his chest. That was why there was a mark on the backside of his palm. With the metal plate hidden in his chest, at the last moment, he had mobilized the jinqi of Tianyi Dao in the small circle to protect his heart meridian. In addition to the cushioning of his palm, it finally allowed Fan Xian to keep his life under such a terrifying punch. The battle between the Qing Emperor Fan Xian and his son had only just begun, but they were already dozens of feet apart. Looking at each other through the wind and snow, victory and defeat had already been decided. No matter how well Fancian prepared, there was still a large difference in strength. The wonders of a great grandmaster could not be made up for with hard work. From the moment he pulled out his sword, Fancian first used Tianny Dao's method of borrowing power, the exquisite natural sword technique he had learned from Haitang, and then, using the power of the Yi family's coffin breaker Sanzhou to combine the four swords of Tianny Dao into the fatal strike he had learned from Sigejian. The sinister kick at the tip of his foot and the metal plate in his chest were the martial arts he had learned from being hammered by Uncle Wu Zhu when he was young. They were the little tricks Fan Xian relied on to become famous. The foundation he used to activate these wondrous skills and merge them together was the tyrannical Jinshi he had diligently cultivated in his body for over 20 years and had long become a part of his body. There were 4 great grandmasters and a blind man in the world. The top martial arts in the world were all displayed by Fan Xian alone. In this world, only Fan Xian had such good luck to be able to learn so many exquisite skills. From another perspective, it was because the warriors who had died or left had placed their last hope of resisting the Qing Emperor on Fan Xian's body that he could have a fair battle with the Emperor. Even though he had built up power for 3 consecutive attacks and learned the ultimate skills of the great grandmasters, he still did not gain any advantage in front of the Emperor. From beginning to end, the Emperor had only taken 1 step back, struck out 2 fingers, and threw out 1 punch to heavily injure Fan Xian. How could such a difference be closed by hard training and meditation? A superior 9th level ace was already a rarely seen pinnacle figure in this world. Given Fan Xian's current cultivation, he could go anywhere in the world. However, facing a great grandmaster, no one had imagined that a superior 9th level ace would have any possibility of challenging someone of a higher level. For Fan Xian to be able to force the Emperor back 1 step in the wind and snow and survive one of the Emperor's punches was enough to shock the world and make him proud. Fan Xian coughed up blood and took off his other boot. Standing barefoot in the cold, snowy ground, he narrowed his eyes slightly. A never-before-seen pride and confidence rose in them. This abrupt emotion in the face of a crushing defeat was not because he had forced back the Emperor or because he had survived. Rather, it was because in his calm heart there was an affirmation of his own judgment. The Emperor was old. Fan Xian had been in seclusion for 7 days. Other than thinking about the battle of the heart and preserving the lives of those he loved, what Fan Xian thought about the most was the problem of the Emperor's true condition. Just what kind of realm was the great grandmaster's realm? Fan Xian had seen Yi Luyun attack and Sigejian, but this was different. Since the great grandmasters were said to be unfathomable, how could he assess the Emperor's true strength? Fortunately, when he was in Dongyi, before Sigejian died, this great grandmaster had discussed the problem of the Qing Emperor's realm with Fan Xian for a long time. He had come to a somewhat blurry, but close to the truth. The Qing Emperor's cultivation had been successful. During the northern expedition, the tyrannical Jinshi in his body had exceeded its limit. In one fell swoop, it had destroyed all the meridians in his body and turned him into a cripple. In the end, for some reason, not only did the Emperor return to normal, but he also became the 4th great grandmaster in the world. The meridians in Fan Xian's body had also exploded. With the help of the begonia and the care of Tianny Dao's natural method, he had luckily repaired his meridians. Back then, how had the Emperor survived? Sigejian had exchanged blows with the Qing Emperor on Dong Mountain. He had told Fan Xian of his judgment. Presently, the Qing Emperor's body no longer had the meridians that a human should have. His entire body had become an opening. Jinshi flowed through his body without any hindrance. Regardless of whether it was in or out, it was fast to a shocking degree. Since there were no longer the restrictions of meridians, the tyrannical Jinshi in the Qing Emperor's body could continue to cultivate endlessly until it reached a realm that no human dared to hope for. Each great grandmaster had their own way of breaking through realms. Some relied on their closeness to heaven and earth. Some relied on their cold and severe hearts that saw heaven and earth as nothing. However, the Qing emperor did not break through that realm by questioning his inner heart. Instead, he valiantly and endlessly solidified his cultivation. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body accumulated like an ocean and used a quantitative change to achieve a qualitative change. This was the Qing emperor's most terrifying power. It was only by relying on the limitless Jinqi in his body and his unusually fast breathing method that he was able to cross half the lake with one finger on Dong Mountain. He sent half of the Jinqi he had cultivated for decades into Ku He's body in the grace of one finger, bursting through his skin. If one could confirm the true nature of the Qing emperor's great grandmaster realm, then there was a question worth pondering. Half of the tyrannical Jinqi the Qing emperor had accumulated for decades had been sent into Ku He's body. It was worth it to use such a large loss to kill a great grandmaster. However, the Qing emperor would probably have to spend many years to recover this loss. Normal martial cultivators only needed a few days of meditation to recover their Jinqi to its original state. Even if half of the Jinqi in their bodies was used up, they would only need a few months to recover. However, the Qing emperor's path had always been different from anyone else's. The Jinqi in other people's bodies was, at most, a pond. Even the great grandmasters were, at most, a small lake. However, their method of using the small lake was to make the lake water evaporate. What they did was a miraculous method. However, the Qing emperor's body was an ocean. With half of it gone, it would probably be impossible to refill it in a short 3 years. Half of the ocean was still unfathomable. It was still not something Fan Xian could oppose. However, the Qing emperor had suffered attacks endlessly these years. The Jingdo rebellion, his heart hurt, the death of his son, and the death of his mother. His state of mind had probably been damaged. Furthermore, the injury the black wheelchair in the royal study had caused the emperor last autumn probably could not be completely healed. Even a great grandmaster could not be completely immune to Chun Pingping's methods. If the emperor was still the emperor from before Dong Mountain, even if he was the emperor from 3 years ago who smiled warmly and appeared moderate but was actually cold and stern, Fan Xian would not have had a chance at all. Fan Xian understood the scene on Dong Mountain very well. He knew the terrifying power of the emperor's way of the emperor's killing fist. The emperor's punch was clearly not as good as the one on Dong Mountain. No matter how many life-saving abilities Fan Xian used, and even the breathing method he had hidden at the bottom of the chest, Fan Xian was still alive. If it had been the original emperor, this punch would probably have shattered Fan Xian's palm, the metal plate under his clothes, and half his body. This was enough to prove that the emperor had already stepped down from his divine altar. He was old and far from being as powerful as he had been in the past. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the emperor on the other side of the wind and snow. Fresh blood seeped out from the side of his lips, but there was a refreshing smile on his face. It was rare in his life that he had fought without fear of death. Furthermore, he faintly smelled a glimmer of victory. It was truly refreshing. The emperor also looked at his son through the sky, full of wind and snow. His eyes narrowed slightly. A cold light flashed and then disappeared in them. He knew very well why Fan Xian was able to survive his punch. It was not because of that sinister kick, nor was it because of the other party's ingenuity and the palm in front of his fist. Furthermore, it was not because of that ridiculous and absurd piece of steel plate. It was because of Fan Xian's footwork, which allowed him to fly dozens of feet through the snowy sky, like a floating snowflake without any effort. Because it was floating without any effort, most of the Jinqi power in the emperor's way of the emperor's punch was completely wasted in the endless snowy sky. It did not truly land on Fan Xian's body. The question was, where did Fan Xian's footwork come from? There was no one in this world who could fly dozens of feet through the air as if they were weightless. The emperor's eyes narrowed even more. He realized that he could not see through his son. He didn't know just how many surprises Fan Xian had waiting for him. You already have Hong Xiang's strength. The emperor's voice passed through the sky full of wind and snow and clearly entered Fan Xian's ears. Fan Xian's expression froze slightly. He knew that this was the emperor's ultimate affirmation of himself. Back then, other than the four great grandmasters, eunuch Hong's strength was the most unfathomable. The emperor had once said that if it were not for the fact that Hong Xiang's body was abnormal, there would probably be one more great grandmaster in this world. Fan Xian felt slightly proud that the emperor was comparing him to Hong Xiang. He also knew that the emperor must have seen that the method he used to dispel the way of the emperor's punch earlier was strange. Yes, it was the method that Master Ku he had asked Sigu Jian to pass on to Fan Xian before he died. Fan Xian breathed in the wind and snow and wandered intimately through the air like a bird. It was all because he could feel the faint ripples between heaven and earth. I'm not writing anymore. I really can't write anymore. It's too damn hard to write. There are a lot of things to do during the new year, yet I have to write about this. I really want to curse. In reality, I've also cursed many times in front of the computer. Chapter 737. In the wind and snow, Fan Xian's face was expressionless as he calmly breathed. His slightly trembling palms faced the sky. Every inch of skin and every pore on his body was greedily absorbing the nameless and shapeless yuanqi between heaven and earth. A faint layer of light covered his clothes. He didn't know what these clear and lively yuanqi waves were, where they came from, or how they were born. After he first sensed the existence of these things by the EC, he discovered that when he followed the chaotic breathing method recorded in the small book, he seemed to be able to absorb the yuanqi between heaven and earth into his body and turn it into jinqi. Earlier, he had been shaken and sent flying. In a flash, the tyrannical jinqi in Fan Xian's body, which had always been abundant and famous, felt a sense of exhaustion. Faced with such a dangerous situation, it was impossible for him to hide anything. In front of the emperor, he began to adjust his breathing again. Although the current emperor was injured, moved, and old, he was still a great grandmaster. With a raise of his hand and a move of his foot, he controlled the situation. Fan Xian had no choice but to use all the strength in his body to respond. In an instant, the sea of qi in his body was almost empty. Although he greedily absorbed the yuanqi between heaven and earth, the waves in the wind and snow were very weak. The yuanqi he could feel was very thin. For his current situation, it was of no help at all. Although he recovered his qi a little faster and could barely stand in the snow, how could it help him defeat a great grandmaster? For the warriors of this land, the magic overseas had always been an existence of little value. They were disdained. Even Master Ku He, who had a broad heart and was never afraid of anything, a great grandmaster who even dared to eat human flesh, began to study magic in the last days of his life and was fortunate enough to obtain that little booklet. However, he still did not walk another path. At most, it could only be considered an auxiliary method. Just like Fan Xian now, he breathed in and out, meditated, and restrained his qi. It was like he wanted to breathe in a paddy field, but he couldn't take in much oxygen from the mud and muddy water. He couldn't wait any longer. The figure in the bright yellow dragon robe at the other end of the wind and snow had already begun to slowly and determinedly tread through the snow. The distance of dozens of feet seemed far. It seemed that the snowflakes there were countless times smaller than the snowflakes here. For the Qing Emperor and Fan Xian, what was the difference between the end of the world and close proximity? There was no joy or anger in Fan Xian's eyes. There was only a momentary calm. The slightly deformed Wei Emperor's sword was held horizontally across his brows. A cold light shone brightly. The two circulations in his body swept slightly across his chest, causing the snow mountain behind his waist to shine brightly. Ever since he was reborn, the vigorous jinqi that he had accumulated by diligently consolidating his foundation and meditating every day was like a snowy mountain being illuminated by the scorching sun. In an instant, it was released into a gurgling stream. The water in the stream grew more and more, converging into a small river, then a large river, rushing through his meridians that were thicker than anyone else's in the world. It flowed to his limbs and every inch of his body, strengthening his mind and hammering his body. Fan, Sien, and in it, of, the and he, of, and of, he of, and. A streak of lightning-like sword light lit up the gloomy world. It lit up each snowflake and goose feather. One could clearly see the edges of the snowflake. After the 3 strikes earlier, and under the powerful pressure the Emperor had exerted, the Sigu sword Fan Sien had inherited from Dongyi's sword hut, under the protection of the 2 Jinshi in his body and the protection of the lightness of his body, had finally merged perfectly and truly reached the realm of perfection. This strike had the same light as when the shadow had stabbed Sigu Jian in the manner of the master of Dongyi. With a strange, unpleasant crack, Fan Sien miserably and dispiritedly fell to the ground from midair. He flew back and landed heavily on the snowy ground. The snow lotus he had stepped on earlier was still maintaining its shape in the air. From this, it could be seen how fast he had come and gone. It was so fast that the snow lotus hadn't even had time to shatter. He had come confidently and stabbed as he wished. It was forceful and natural. However, he had retreated even faster. He was wretched and frightening. The Emperor slowly pulled back the fist that had been stretched out horizontally in the air. That steady and tyrannical fist. He narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at Fan Sien in the snow. He remained silent. In front of Fan Sien's strike, even the Emperor had to slightly avoid its edge. Thus, this fist did not have enough power. Since the punch earlier had not killed Fan Sien, presumably, this punch would not kill him either. As expected, Fan Sien was like an unkillable cockroach. He climbed up from the snowy ground with difficulty. A trace of blood that was about to be frozen by the cold hung at the corner of his lips. He stared coldly at the Emperor's calm eyes and suddenly spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. All the omnipotent methods in the world, regardless of whether it was speed, skill, or movement, were built on the foundation of Jinshi. If the lake of Qi was not enough, how could one be as fast as lightning? How could one use techniques that had already obtained the wonders of heaven and earth? Jinshi was the foundation of martial arts. The meridians in Fan Sien's body were different from those of a normal person. The method he practiced was different from that of a normal person. It was full of tyrannical power. Looking at the world, he was truly an anomaly. However, the Emperor's body was also different from that of a normal person. The meridians in his body were not as broad and different as Fan Sien's. He had no meridians at all. His entire body, from the top of his head to the tips of his toes, was a channel of Jinshi. The Emperor's tyrannical martial method was even more powerful. Amidst the violence, there was a natural aura of the way of the Emperor. Comparatively speaking, the Emperor was like an upgraded version of Fan Sien. Fan Sien was a little strange creature, and the Emperor was a big monster. If Fan Sien wanted to use his own strength and top Jinshi cultivation to fight the Emperor head-on, it was, without question, a valiant and absurd choice. It was still the same old saying. On this land, regardless of whether it was personal cultivation or power, Fan Sien was already one of the most powerful people. No, in reality, he was already the second in the world. He had admitted this himself, but he was facing the first in the world, the most powerful person in the world. There was not a glimmer of defeat in Fan Sien's calm eyes. Narrowing them slightly, he watched the Emperor's gradually approaching footsteps through the wind and snow. He knew that when the Emperor walked step by step in front of him, it would be the moment he would no longer be able to rely on that strange method to gain an advantage in movement. Fresh blood dripped from between his lips and wet the front of his clothes. It was quickly frozen into a patch of bloody frost by the cold air of the palace. Fan Sien's pitch-black pupils constricted slightly. He held the sword of the Wei Emperor upside down and held it horizontally in front of him. He was on full alert. Using the strip of cloth tied around his wrist, he wiped the blood at the corner of his lips and licked his lips. In a raspy voice, he laughed and said, "Very good." Ever since he was young, he had grown up under the care of the Overwatch Council. From his youth, he had been preparing to take control of the Overwatch Council. From his bones to his skin, He had been immersed in the sinister and dark aura of the Overwatch Council. In this life, he had encountered countless storms and powerful enemies. Each time, he would do everything in his power to weaken the other party and use despicable methods that could not see the light to seek the final victory. However, he would rarely bravely use the sword in his hand to carry out the most direct, fierce, and hot-blooded battle against powerful enemies. Looking at the gradually approaching Emperor and feeling the overflowing pressure gradually pressing down on his body, a glimmer of unswerving determination flashed across Fan Xian's delicate face. In such a tense moment, he thought of Yin Xiaoyi holding the longbow in his hand on the cliff in the primitive forest to the north of Danzhou 3 years ago. It seemed that he had also coldly approached his body. On the meadow, Fan Xian had bravely stood up. Now, he had also bravely stood up and stared coldly at the Emperor in the wind and snow. Taking a deep breath, he faced the wind and snow that pounced toward his face and shook his right arm. His feet stepped on the melted snow like a civet stepping on snow and lightning. His figure suddenly swayed and disappeared from his spot. Ran away? The Emperor looked at his son, who had turned into a gray shadow, following the wind and snow, and was about to sweep past the walls of the ruined garden toward the south of the royal palace. He furrowed his brows slightly. A cold smile, with complicated emotions, rose to the corners of his lips. With a shake of the sleeves of his bright yellow dragon robe, he immediately became a blurry yellow shadow. In an instant, he disappeared with Fan Xian's figure. In the air above the royal palace, Fan Xian's hands hung naturally by his sides. With unusual speed, he flew with the wind and snow, becoming a gray shadow on the eaves and walls of the palace. Earlier in the ruined garden, he had assumed the posture of a young cub fighting for his life. However, he had turned around and left, using all of his cultivation to escape into the wind and snow. He wanted to escape from the Emperor's side. He did not feel a glimmer of humiliation in his heart. The Emperor was a great grandmaster, a great monster. In any case, he was not human. It was normal for him to not be able to defeat someone who was not human. Knowing that he could not win, but still staying there to fight for his life was called stupid. Feeling the subtle changes in the wind and snow through his clothes, Fan Xian's figure was unusually beautiful. Like a cold-resistant bird flying freely, he occasionally changed his direction in the air, drawing beautiful arcs. However, his speed did not decrease at all. It was already morning in the royal palace, which had been quiet for a long time. Occasionally, eunuchs and servants sweeping the snow would glance at the gray shadow sweeping past in the air. They all thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. No one in the world could fly that fast. Fan Xian flew freely through the gloomy and quiet royal palace. Every 70 to 80 feet, he would touch the corners of the eaves or the top of the walls slightly. His figure did not slow down at all as he entered another palace. Such movement and speed had never been seen before in the world. A drop of sweat slid down the back of Fan Xian's neck and onto his back. Using the full power of the flying technique, it did not use up too much of his jinqi. Borrowing the power of heaven and earth to escape into heaven and earth, he had already obtained the wonders of heaven and earth. Flying through the air, on the contrary, calmed his state of mind. The 2 circulations in his body also began to warm up. Bit by bit, it mended the gap he had created under the Emperor's pressure. Furthermore, that nameless technique seemed to be put to full use in the harmonious atmosphere of heaven and earth. It made his recovery speed grow faster and his condition grow better and better. The tip of his foot tapped the head of a stone beast on the corner of the eaves, but the copper bell in the beast's mouth did not even ring. Fan Xian flew above the palace in the air and looked down at the earth. The people in the palace had a feeling of floating in the air and looking down on the common people, particularly the people boiling water or sweeping snow. Not a single one of them noticed someone flying through the air. It was a strange feeling. However, the sweat on Fan Xian's back continued to flow. Although he had completely merged his mind into this harmonious realm and would not turn his head to look, he could still clearly feel a powerful and hidden power following him at a steady pace. It was like the footsteps of the god of death. Although slow, he would never be able to shake it off. Fan Xian had not thought that he would still be unable to shake off the emperor behind him even after he had raised his speed to such a realm. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly as he charged toward the tall lower gate of the royal palace in the distance to the south. From the abandoned garden in the northwest corner of the royal palace, Fan Xian escaped lightly and headed south. Strangely, he did not choose the closest northern palace gate or the palace walls to jump over. He had negotiated with the emperor for so long in the palace, so he had something to rely on. Both father and son knew what the situation was. Fan Xian had promised the emperor that this was only a battle between the two of them. For the sake of the Qing kingdom's future generations, the emperor would only place the pressure of an emperor on Fan Xian alone. As long as Fan Xian was able to escape this time, at least the world would be at peace for many years. For the sake of the bargaining chips hidden in various places under heaven, the emperor would not act against Fan Xian's subordinates before he killed Fan Xian. This was the meaning of the emperor's words. The emperor would not allow the existence of a power that could threaten him to remain hidden within his kingdom. Thus, he had to kill Fan Xian. However, Fan Xian did not leave the palace. Although the royal palace sealed off all directions and the tall red palace walls were said to be able to stop any ninth-level ace in the world, Uncle Wu Zhu's luring of Eunuch Hong out of the palace had already proved that these palace walls were not a natural barrier to warriors who truly stood at the peak of the world. Furthermore, for someone like Fan Xian, who had put endless effort into the art of flying since he was young, Fan Xian headed south, always heading south. He headed south in the royal palace, where snow fell. He swept past Shufang Palace, Hongguang Palace, the dilapidated Eastern Palace, and Guanxing Palace. He saw many people, but no one in the royal palace saw him. He swept past 3 main palaces, 6 side courtyards, and 72 women. Finally, he flipped onto the tallest Taiji Palace in the entire royal palace. No one had ever come to the top of the towering palace, other than when it was newly built at the beginning of the country. Perhaps the craftsmen had been busy up there. It was said that when this palace was being built, 2 people fell to their deaths. In the end, they had even invited people from the Tianidao Temple from the Wei Kingdom to calm the resentful spirits. The yellow glazed tiles of Taiji Palace were covered in a thick layer of snow. The 2 colors mixed together beautifully. It was like a very beautiful material that one could not bear to destroy. Fan Xian did not have any time or mood to admire the snow. He floated directly upward along the middle of Taiji Palace. Although it was incomparably slippery under his feet, it was unable to tilt his body in the slightest. Sweeping up, the tips of his feet stepped onto the towering dragon bones in the middle of Taiji Palace. Fan Xian stood in the wind. His body was surrounded by drifting snow, and the sleeves of his clothes rustled. At this moment, he was standing at the highest point of the royal palace. In front of him was the majestic main gate of the royal palace. Around him were seemingly extremely low palace walls. He could even see that most of Jingdou was trapped in a hazy snowstorm. He didn't know where Ro was after leaving the palace. He didn't know if and the others had already left Jingdou. Fan Xian stood at the highest point of the royal palace and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the distant layers of Jingdou's private residences. He waited for the bright yellow figure to appear behind him. Fan Xian did not turn around. A powerful disappointment flashed through his eyes because the sound he had been waiting for did not ring out. The change he had been waiting for did not happen. The entire royal palace remained silent, particularly above this majestic hall. Other than him and the emperor behind him, there was only wind and snow. There was nothing else. Fan Xian slid down along the glazed tiles of the hall. Although a great battle in the wind and snow at the summit of the Forbidden Palace was presumably a very entertaining and dignified way of doing things, in Fan Xian's opinion, one could only live with dignity and not die with it. The gray figure and the bright yellow figure landed lightly on the thick snow in front of Taiji Palace at almost the same time and stopped. The emperor stood in front of the long corridor of Taiji Palace. Behind him was the serene door of the main hall. Usually, he would summon his officials in this palace and control the life and death of countless people in the world. Now he stood there alone. Fan Xian stood in the middle of the square in front of the palace. Beside him was a thick layer of snow. He looked at the thick royal palace gate in the distance and narrowed his eyes slightly. Perhaps it was because he felt that he did not have the power to break through that palace gate. He slowly turned around and looked at the emperor. Actually, no matter what develops in the end, it is just like two wild beasts tearing at each other. The emperor was silent. His expression was cold. He looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at a dead man. At this moment, the ruler and the minister finally stopped their unimaginable flying chase. They stood quietly in front of the hall and revealed themselves in front of the tens of thousands of people. The eunuchs sweeping the snow outside the palace, the serving girls walking quietly in the long corridor, and the guards standing with green and red faces holding knives all opened their mouths in shock. They looked at the emperor and Sir Fan Jr. in the snow. They were inexplicably shocked and couldn't speak for a moment. Fan Xian looked calmly at the emperor, but he was thinking of other things in his heart. He had sensed something strange. Heading straight from a northwest abandoned garden to the south of the royal palace, the emperor had come close to him a number of times along the way and found a moment to kill or capture him. However, the emperor had not taken action. Why was this? Presumably, the emperor, who had furrowed his brows slightly, also did not understand why Fan Xian did not want to escape from the palace and instead headed south. Why was this? Fan Xian was waiting for a variable. Unfortunately, after the emperor revealed himself in Taiji Palace, the first variable did not happen. Then what about the second? The emperor had calculated every detail about how much power Fan Xian had. The variable at this moment had to be a variable that even Fan Xian didn't know about. It was just like the immortal game in the Hanging Temple. Coincidences, winds, and clouds gathered. Everyone in the game had their own goals. In the end, no one could control a variable that would appear. Fan Xian firmly believed that this variable that he did not know about would happen. The Hanging Temple incident had mobilized four powers. As the Qing Kingdom's greatest enemy, the Northern Qi court had maintained its silence. Northern Qi inherited the Wei Kingdom and had operated in this world for thousands of years. Did they not have any means to deal with the Qing Kingdom's greatest threat? Fan Xian did not believe it. He firmly believed that the Northern Qi people were hiding a trump card in the royal palace. Now, the Qing ruler and official, father and son, had turned against each other. Blood had splashed on the royal palace. It was the best time for the Northern Qi emperor to use his trump card. Like the sound of a war drum, there was a muffled thud. It was as if a great battle had erupted. Tens of thousands of taut bowstrings sang in unison. In reality, it was only the giant city guarding crossbow at the corner tower of the royal palace. The mechanism tightened with a spring fired in this silent and even oppressive moment. The steel crossbow bolt, as thick as a child's arm, instantly became a bolt of black lightning under the powerful force of the spring. It broke through the air near the corner tower of the royal palace and caused the air to explode. It tore through the endlessly dancing snowflakes in the air in front of Taiji Palace and spun at high speed. It forcefully split open a deep tunnel in space and shot toward the bright yellow figure in front of the palace. No one knew how the cast base of the city guarding crossbow had been turned around and aimed in the direction of the royal palace. No one knew how the Northern Qi people had infiltrated the Qing Kingdom's imperial soldiers and secretly taken control of the corner tower. Fan Xian only knew that the Northern Qi people's trump card had finally been used. This was enough. With a sharp whistle, Fan Xian gathered his qi into his feet. His body became as heavy as a boulder and moved like a waterfall. He moved with his sword and followed closely behind the giant crossbow, whistling toward the emperor. The crossbow closed in on him. In the end, the distance was too far. The great Grandmaster Emperor only needed to flick his sleeves and retreat. Forcefully relying on his powerful cultivation to turn distance into time, he would be able to avoid this startling crossbow bolt. However, Fan Xian had already caught a glimpse of a trembling, serving girl kneeling on the ground in the long corridor. She had already stood up. A glimmer of coldness flashed through her eyes. She pulled out a thin needle from her hair and stabbed it toward the emperor's back. Regardless of whether it was the Northern Qi people or Fan Xian, they all seemed to have underestimated the Qing emperor's willpower and reaction, which he had honed for decades. Just as everyone thought that the bright yellow figure in front of Taiji Palace would temporarily avoid the tip of the giant crossbow bolt, the emperor's figure disappeared from his spot and abruptly took 3 steps forward in the snow. With a loud bang, the giant crossbow bolt brushed past the tip of the emperor's hair and pierced ruthlessly into the smooth, jade-like stone ground. In an instant, it shattered the stone's surface into pieces like tofu. Bricks and mud flew wildly in all directions. It just happened to block the sneak-attacking serving girl assassin behind the stone shards. The emperor's right arm shook his dragon sleeve. A powerful wave of Jinqi wrapped around the stone shards and snowflakes that filled the sky behind him. Like a giant dragon, it struck the serving girl's body. Fresh blood sprayed everywhere. Countless stone shards and snowflakes struck the serving girl's body like arrows. In an instant, hundreds and thousands of wounds appeared on her body. The assassin didn't even have time to attack once. She didn't even have time to make a sound before collapsing into the snow and turning into a pile of bloody flesh. Borrowing the power of this brush, the distance between the emperor and Fan Xian shrunk a little. Fan Xian was charging with all his might. In a flash, the father and son were inches away from each other. They were so close that Fan Xian could see the emperor's slightly thin face, the pair of ice-cold eyes that no longer had any emotion, and the killing intent that seeped out of the calm eyes. Northern Qi's trump card was indeed powerful. Regardless of who it was used against, it was probably enough. However, when it was used against a great grandmaster like the emperor, it was very ugly. There was not a trace of disappointment in Fan Xian's eyes. He continued to swing his sword through the air, viciously stabbing toward the emperor's eye socket. It was still the same situation as the last 2 times they had exchanged blows. The Wei Emperor's sword in Fan Xian's hand could not strike the emperor, who was like an immortal or a demon, moving endlessly in this small space. The tip of the sword spat out a sharp light. Dejectedly and powerlessly, it pierced through the air beside the emperor's face. It made a hissing sound, but it was to no avail. However, the emperor's fist had already come crashing over. This was a true punch of the way of the emperor. The emperor no longer held anything back. His jade-like fist suppressed all the whiteness in this sky, full of wind and snow. It flashed with a light that should not exist in the mortal world as it smashed toward Fan Xian's chest. The emperor's face was also very white, an unhealthy white. It was as if this great grandmaster had gathered all the Jinqi in his body, which was like an ocean, into this punch. If he was hit by this punch, even if Fan Xian had the world's 2 most exquisite kinds of Jinqi to protect his body and an exquisite bird-like movement to neutralize the force, he could only be smashed to pieces. At this moment, the Wei Emperor's sword left Fan Xian's hand. It whistled through the snowy air and headed toward the tightly closed door of the great hall. Facing the fist that was shining with white holy light, he let out a shrill howl. His entire body began to tremble violently. A finger, 3 feet away, slowly and clumsily pointed at His Majesty's face. The slowness was only a feeling. In reality, the tip of the finger contained all the Jinqi Fan Xian could force out in his life. It was too heavy. The intangible energy had a feeling of substance, as if it had weight. It made his finger tremble wildly in the snowy air. His body was also trembling. His face was unusually pale, but his eyes were unusually bright. Even if Fan Xian had a sword in his hand, he would not be able to pierce the emperor's body, much less a finger. Furthermore, his finger was still some distance away from the emperor. The emperor's murderous fist was about to touch his clothes. A sharp sound rang out from the tip of Fan Xian's finger. It was like a demon tearing through the disguise of a human body outside and burrowing out from the skin and flesh. It was also like the notes in the bamboo flute. Because no one had suppressed them for too long, they could no longer endure the loneliness and wanted to burrow out of the holes to become a few wisps of clear music in the air. A clear and cold sword chi, sharp and full of murderous intent, spat out from the tip of Fan Xian's finger. In an instant, it surpassed the space between the two of them and pierced toward the emperor's throat. He remembered when he was young and the Danzhou naughty children were laughable. Why did Jinqi immediately disappear into the air when it left the body? Uncle Wu Zhu did not know internal strength, so he could not explain it. Why had none of the martial cultivators in the world tried it? Fan Xian, who was still a naughty child, began to try it. With unusual difficulty, without anyone's guidance or correction, he silently practiced for a long time. Then, the Jinqi in his body spat out from his palm and returned to his body within a minute distance. Was this due to the two circulations in his body, or was it due to his persistence and hard work? However, what was the use of this? It wasted a lot of his time. By the time he entered Jingdou and cultivated the nameless tyrannical martial method, he was still unable to shock the world with one battle like Haitang or 13th Wan. The Jinqi that returned freely to his palm could not be used in a real battle. It could not be released outside his body to form a killing weapon. Other than climbing Danzhou's cliffs, Red Palace walls, stealing keys, and stealing kisses from his fiancée, what use was there? However, Fan Xian was not satisfied. Back then, Yi Luyun had come to that cliff and left tens of thousands of holes on the beach. He knew there were people in the world who could control the Jinqi released outside their body. Thus, he stubbornly and even foolishly followed this path. Unfortunately, until a long time later, he still had no way. This was because Fan Xian did not know that other than a strange creature like him, only people in the world who had reached that realm could control the Jinqi released outside their body. Although the swords of the 9th level aces in the sword hut could have a faint sword light, there was a qualitative difference between that and the progress of the human body itself. The foolish naughty child gradually grew up. The supreme martial method that everyone saw as a treasure became a symbol of stubbornness in his hands. It was not until one day on the shore of the East Sea that he finally felt the Jinqi moving back and forth in his palm. Finally, it gradually extended out a little more. His mind could clearly feel the ripples of aura that were no longer in his body. Presently, Fan Xian could already feel the ripples of yuanqi between heaven and earth. Of course, he could clearly feel the aura of his Jinqi and be able to control it. Regardless of whether it was because of that foolish and stubborn youth stubbornness or because of that little booklet, the final result was the invisible sword chi shooting out from the tip of his finger. With a sword in hand, how could he stab the illusory, bright yellow figure in front of him? The tip of his finger trembled. With just a thought, the sword chi flowed and split the air. Who could dodge it? The emperor could not either. In front of this swift and fierce sword chi, he only had time to turn his body. His fist brushed past Fan Xian's shoulder and struck empty air. Although it struck empty air, the clothes on Fan Xian's left shoulder were still completely shredded. A large hole appeared in the snow behind him. Snowflakes danced in all directions. The sword chi at the tip of Fan Xian's finger also struck the emperor. More accurately, it brushed past the emperor's neck. The invisible sword chi tore open the thin layer of skin on the emperor's neck. Fresh blood seeped out. The opportunity could not be missed. Fan Xian once again spat out a sharp cry from his lips. He forced all of the remaining Jinqi in his body to the tip of his finger. Pressing down through the air, he stabbed again toward the emperor's eye socket. The emperor's punch missed. The paleness of his face deepened. Looking at Fan Xian's finger stabbing toward him again, there was no fear in the emperor's eyes. On the contrary, a mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips. The emperor also extended an index finger and pressed down toward the tip of Fan Xian's finger. His figure floated forward. In an instant, the distance between the two of them shrank to nothing. The air hissed. In a flash, the tip of the emperor's finger touched the tip of Fan Xian's finger that was endlessly shooting out sword chi. Two slender index fingers came together. One finger trembled endlessly, but the other was unusually stable. The air between the two fingers stirred. The light gradually grew brighter, forcing the snowflakes in the air to retreat. The smile on the corners of the Emperor's lips disappeared. He gently waved his right arm. Holding Dong Mountain in his index finger, he pressed down toward Fan Xian. With a crack, Fan Xian's index finger completely shattered. It was as if his body had been struck by a god's hammer. His entire body flew backward like a kite. However, he did not fly backward like he had done earlier. Instead, it was as if his entire body no longer had any strength to support itself. Abruptly, he fell into the snow and was unable to move. The ruler and official, father and son, fighting to the death on the snowy ground, seemed to have forgotten about the sword that had missed earlier and the Wei Emperor's sword that had fallen from Fan Xian's hand and whistled toward the front door of Taiji Palace. However, this pair of father and son did not forget. Because in such a battle, this pair of father and son, who were the strongest in the world, would definitely not make any unnecessary movements or waste any unnecessary strength. Once the sword flew, there would be a follow-up. The follow-up was the exquisite and complicated decorations on Taiji Palace's secluded front door. When Fan Xian's fingertips spat out a shocking sword chi for the first time, the tightly closed front door of Taiji Palace had strangely opened. 13th Wang, dressed in cloth clothing, flew out of the pitch-black center of the Qing court. In midair, he caught the Wei Emperor's sword that had fallen from Fan Xian's hand. Bending his right elbow slightly, he swept through the air like lightning. His figure grew slightly. With an explosive roar, he gathered the killing strike he had been accumulating for a long time and viciously stabbed toward the back of the Emperor's neck. 13th Wang's bravery was unparalleled. The bravery carried by this strike was displayed to the extreme. Compared to the white-clothed shadow strike that had jumped out of the sun in the Hanging Temple, it was 3 times hotter and 3 times brighter. It was clearly a sneak attack from behind the Emperor, yet forcefully gave off an open and honorable feeling. The last disciple of the Sword Hut with a pure heart of swordsmanship had all received Sigu Jian's teachings. That night, he had also gained an understanding of the tyrannical Jinchi from Fan Xian and Sigu Jian's conversation. At this moment, he had gathered his entire life's cultivation into one strike. It was extremely powerful. If Fan Xian faced this strike, he would probably also be injured. However, the Emperor seemed to know that a 9th-level ace would suddenly run out from the Serene Hall behind him and strike Fan Xian to the ground with a finger as heavy as a mountain. His face did not change at all. He didn't turn around. Instead, he swept out his sleeve behind him. In this life, the Qing Emperor's one punch, one finger, and one sleeve was enough to stand at the peak of the world. No one dared to look up to his light. However, his sleeve was unable to swallow the mountains and rivers and sweep up 13th Wang's heroic strike like a whirlwind in clouds. In the end, he was a man and not a god. Just as Fan Xian had judged, the Emperor was no longer at his peak. His years of loneliness, old age, and illness, regardless of whether it was physically or mentally, had made him actively or passively choose to step down from the altar. 13th Wang's explosive cry still echoed through the empty royal palace. The Wei Emperor's sword, which was spitting out sword light, had already pierced through the powerful Qing Emperor's dragon sleeve with a whoosh and brushed past the Emperor's chest. When the Emperor brushed out his sleeve, he had already turned his body slightly. Although 13th Wang's strike was ferocious, it still only brushed past him and only scratched a bit of the Qing Emperor's flesh. The hand in the Emperor's sleeve had already stretched out like a golden dragon from the clouds. Miraculously, it caught 13th Wang's wrist. 13th Wang's wrist shook. The Wei Emperor's sword in his hand raised its head like a snake and pierced toward the Qing Emperor's chin from an impossible angle. The Qing Emperor gave a muffled grunt. His shoulder moved back delicately and crashed into 13th Wang's chest. With a crack, 13th Wang sprayed out a mouthful of blood. Who knew how many of his ribs were broken? He felt a powerful force shake him away. With a muffled grunt, a bright red light flared in his eyes. Disregarding his life and death, He reached out with a backhand and grabbed the emperor's right hand tightly, unwilling to let go. At this critical moment, a flower shadow flashed out from behind 13th Wang. It was as if she had not been there earlier. She flashed out cleanly and naturally like a returning traveler longing for hot water or a flowering tree in the wind and snow needing warmth. She naturally grabbed the emperor's other hand, left hand. Hiding Duo had come. This northern Qi saint girl, the present leader of Tianyi Dao, was like a quiet and weak woman attached to the Qing emperor's side. Beside the Qing emperor's sleeve, she was like a cloud or a petal that could not be shaken off or shaken off. Blindly close and naturally, it made one loathe and feel fear in one's heart. For some reason, Haitang did not choose to attack the Qing emperor's vitals. Instead, she released all of her cultivation and wrapped around the Qing emperor's left hand. The Qing emperor's eyes were unusually cold and calm. His already thin face seemed to grow even thinner. His eyes sunk in deeply. His face was pale. He knew that the young man holding his hands was someone the two old fellows had left behind to deal with him. However, his expression still did not change. Only a bell-like, ringing sound rang out from his not-so-strong chest. Powerful Jinqi instantly invaded the bodies of the two young superior, 9th-level aces. In a breath, 13th Wang's right arm began to scorch and wither. It began to shake as numerous streaks of fresh blood flowed out from his nose, ears, and mouth. Haiding Duo's condition was not good either. A mouthful of fresh blood spat out from between her lips. Her body also began to tremble violently. It was as if she could be shaken into the snow by the emperor at any moment. The snowy ground of Taiji Palace was beginning to be dyed with blood red. Fan Xian lay dejectedly in the snow not far away. It was as if he could no longer move. It was as if no one could help Haidang and 13th Wang. These two young people who had once been publicly acknowledged by the great grandmasters as the most likely to enter the grandmaster realm were going to die at the hands of the only remaining great grandmaster in the world. A sense of wariness flashed through the emperor's heart. Although he had been wary of everything since last night, he had never been arrogant because of his great grandmaster realm. He was not Sigajian. He did not give Fan Xian and his people any chances. Although he had not discovered the variable he feared the most had happened until now in Taiji Palace. This sense of wariness still made him narrow his eyes and look at the patch of snow in front of him that was dripping with a red hue. Wherever the emperor's gaze touched, the snowy ground seemed to begin to melt rapidly. This was not the emperor's gaze burning. Indeed, from the moment Fan Xian's fingertips spat out sword qi, the snowy ground below had begun to melt. All of this had happened in a flash. The Qing emperor had wounded Fan Xian with one finger and locked down the two young aces with his hands. Only then did the snowy ground truly melt and loosen. Under the snowy ground was a white-clothed man. This was the foremost assassin in the world, the king who forever walked in the dark, the head of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, the foremost disciple of the sword hut in Dongi, and the shadow beside the wheelchair. In his life, he had only worn white twice. The first time was in the Hanging Temple. He had leaped out of the sun. His entire body seemed to be enveloped in golden light, like a banished immortal. The second time was today. He had been born from the snowy ground. His entire body was pure white like a saint. The shadow had attacked in white twice. Both times, he had faced the same person, the most powerful person in the world. Thus, the shadow's attack today was the most powerful and sinister attack he had ever made. Unlike Fan Xian and 13th Wang, his sword seemed to be white. There was no light on it. It looked simple, unadorned, and dim. His sword was also very simple. It wasn't particularly fast, but it was very stable. The angle he chose was very strange. The angle at which the sword was slanted and the turn of the sword surface were all according to a calculated direction. It was stretched out without the slightest tremble. This attack was too strange. It did not pierce the Qing emperor's face, eye sockets, throat, abdomen, or any other fatal spot. It also did not pierce the toes, knees, or waist, which were unusual choices. Instead, it pierced toward the emperor's left thigh. With a squelch, even someone as powerful as the Emperor could not dodge the shadow's attack. The slightly white tip of the sword gently pierced into the Emperor's thigh, sending out a spray of blood. The shadow was an assassin. His life was to kill. In his eyes, there was no one he could not kill. Just like how many people thought that a wound to the thigh could not cause a fatal injury, the shadow knew that there was a blood gate at the base of the thigh. Once it was broken, blood would spray 50 feet into the air. No one could survive. Although this sword had pierced shallowly into the base of the Emperor's thigh, it was not enough to kill this powerful man. That blood gate had not been pierced through. The shadow, lying in the snow, was like a focused butcher. His speed was steady and careful as he flicked upwards. The Emperor's face was even whiter than the sky, full of snow. In the instant the white-clothed shadow struck out, he was actually already retreating. Bringing Haidang and 13th Wang, who had bound his hands, he slid on the snowy ground and retreated backward. However, the white-clothed shadow still pierced this attack. The Emperor felt a glimmer of pain. His pupils constricted slightly. Then, he became a dragon in the wind and snow, sweeping up all of the snowflakes around him, everyone, all of the sword intent, and all of the resistance. Enveloping everyone present, he floated up in the snow in front of Taiji Palace. Of course, the Emperor is not dead. I was worried that everyone would not be happy when they read to this point, so I had wanted to finish writing all of this today. In the end, it was too difficult. I was about to go crazy from writing, but I could only write to this point. I was almost unable to hold on. However, I did my best. I am very happy. P.S. While I am happy, I recommend a new book to everyone. It is written by Yayan. The book number is 112-6363. Let me clarify, this is not a recommendation because I do not know this author. I am just one of Tan Lang's loyal readers. Although he is known as the supervisor, I think a good book is not afraid of a eunuch, right? Haha. I believe in the quality of the things he writes, so I naturally recommend it for everyone to enjoy. Chapter 738. The wind and snow danced rapidly, following the blurry figures and flying in a clockwise direction in the air. Gradually, they connected into countless lines, looking like the wool woven into a ball in the boudoir of a private house, or the cocoon silk spat out by a spring silkworm in the south of the Yangtze River. They turned into a ball, covering all the figures trapped in a moment of crisis. This white snowy ball was not still. Instead, it retreated with a strange speed toward Taiji Palace behind the snowy ground. No one knew what kind of thoughts the warriors inside had used to ensure that the rapidly spinning snowy threads were not blown into scattered snow by the wind. Earlier, when 13th Wang and Haidang had floated out of Taiji Palace, they had opened 2 doors. At this moment, Taiji Palace was like a giant beast made of shadows. It opened its mouth and prepared to swallow the round and massive snowball into its stomach in one gulp. It was completely dark inside. However, the palace doors were not completely open. The mouth was too small. When the snowball floated to the front doors of Taiji Palace, it was a bit larger than the doors. Snowball quickly hit the door of the hall, but strangely did not make a sound. The wooden door, carved with complex patterns, was instantly destroyed by the killing intent and battle intent contained in Snowball's melding force. Deep scars instantly appeared on the wooden door, and like a withered twig in rotten wood, the door dispersed. Perhaps tens of thousands of years of time could silently destroy everything like this. However, this thing made of hazy snowy threads also produced such a powerful effect. The snowflakes, which should have been weak, became like countless sharp steel knives as they spun at high speed, slicing through everything in the air. Such a terrifying effect was because the great grandmaster in that space was already at the peak of his realm. The snowball pierced through the air, flying over the long imperial path and crashing beneath the imperial platform. There was another sound, and with a boom, the snowball exploded. Snowflakes shot out in all directions like sharp arrows, striking the entire Taiji Palace until it began to tremble. The great beams did not show any signs of breaking, but the beautiful and magnificent palace furnishings had all been smashed into rubble. A number of figures shot out. 13th Wang and Haitang fell dispiritedly into the rubble. Fresh blood sprayed wildly. 13th Wang's arm had long been twisted into strands of flesh and blood. All of his meridians were severed. The shadow who stabbed the last sword was wearing a white robe and was lying on the ground in front of the imperial platform. His head was covered in blood, and he was not moving at all. It was unknown whether he was dead or alive. The sword in his hand was weakly held in his hand, and there was a blood stain on the tip of the sword. In the end, this plain sword was unable to pierce through the blood at the base of the emperor's thigh. Under such circumstances, the shadow's killing blow had clearly pierced into the emperor's flesh. However, as it traveled from the outside of the palace to the inside, heaven and earth shook. The wind and objects moved everywhere. The tip of the sword could not even tremble or move an inch. In the end, it was shaken out of the emperor's body. It was futile. During this period of time, His Majesty relied on his vast Jinshi cultivation and the will of the way of the king to release a domineering force, suppressing everyone in the entire space into the realm of perfect harmony. In this realm, His Majesty's will was the rule of all actions, and no one could resist it. The bright yellow shadow appeared particularly eye-catching on the messy imperial platform. The emperor continued to stand straight and did not even glance at the dragon chair that had become a pile of rotten wood behind him. His face was pale. His hands, which were exposed outside his sleeves, trembled slightly. Although he was injured, he was still insufferably arrogant and undefeatable. The shadow lying on the ground in front of the imperial platform like a dead fish suddenly moved. He floated up just like that. His white robes fluttered in the wind. Blood dripped from the corner of his lips. A vicious sword thrust toward the emperor's throat. The thrust missed. This should have been expected. The shadow's face was pale. Mixed with blood, he spat out a word, retreat. When he sent out his last strike, his body had already swiftly drifted backward. He had not been able to kill the emperor with his first strike, so he would not have another chance today. Although the shadow wholeheartedly wanted to avenge Chun Pingping, who had suffered 1,000 cuts, he was, in the end, an assassin. Of the 4 people who had entered the palace to assassinate, even if his gaze was the most vicious and his state of mind the steadiest, he would still drift away and retreat after one strike. He was only worried that the 2 heavily injured young aces would continue to fight with the emperor without regard for their lives. That was why he had yelled out. Before the sound of this one word had even fallen, 3 figures in the Taiji Palace, which had already become a mess, whistled through the air, rushing out of the palace. Haidang Duo, who was the least injured, fell at the very back. Her flowery cotton-padded jacket unfurled, transforming into a flower shadow that bloomed in the gloomy space of the palace. The moment the flower disappeared, the 3 upper 9th level aces also disappeared from Taiji Palace. The emperor continued to stand silently on the imperial platform. Surprisingly, he did not give chase. Earlier, when the powerful and unyielding domain had been unleashed, the 3 aces had been heavily injured and could no longer recover. They were already at the end of their strength when they fled the palace. If the emperor attacked now, presumably he could easily kill the 3 of them. The emperor did not move. He only quietly lowered his head and spread out his hands. He felt the chill and pain from his neck. He looked at the cut open flesh on his chest, seeping through the bright yellow dragon robe. There was also the bloody hole at the base of his thigh. A clear pain traveled into his brain from 3 places. It made this powerful emperor feel a little dazed. How long had it been since he had been injured? Even 3 years ago on Dong Mountain, when he faced Ku He and Siga Jian, the emperor had only used up the vast Han Jinshi he had nurtured for a lifetime and the unparalleled spirit and aura. Now, faced with a few mere young people, he had been injured. The emperor extended his left hand and wiped it across his chest. Looking at the blood on his pure white palm, he furrowed his brows slightly. He could not suppress the exhaustion he felt. For the first time, he asked himself if he had truly grown old. A heart-palpitating coldness flashed through his eyes. He knew the 4 people who had acted today. There was no need to mention Ji. That brat was actually able to use the external sword chi today. His talent and diligence were indeed impressive. As for the shadow, he had been following that old dog all this time, but had been hiding in the space where the Emperor existed. The #1 assassin in the world was indeed impressive. As for Ku He and Sigu Jian's 2 last disciples, the Emperor was not unfamiliar with them. Although he had never seen Haidang Duo, he knew this Northern Chi Saint girl very well. He knew of the relationship between her and Fan Xian. Back then, the Emperor had even thought about having Fan Xian marry this woman. 13th Wang. The scene on Dong Mountain that year was deeply engraved in the Emperor's heart and greatly admired. Other than the shadow, these 3 outstanding young people would, without question, be the most extraordinary figures in the world. Although they had failed to assassinate the Emperor together, they had still lost with such vigor. The Emperor could not help but admire them and not want to kill them. The Emperor slowly walked out of the quiet Taiji Palace. Step by step, he slowly sorted out the tyrannical Jinshi that had begun to show signs of instability in his body. His expression was cold, and his eyes were unusually cold. Calmly, he looked at the palace doors that had already been successfully opened by Fan Xian and a few others. He did not care how Fan Xian and the others had been able to open the palace doors under the noses of the imperial soldiers and guards. He also did not worry about whether these thorns in his bones, the enemies who reminded him with their youthful pride, would disappear into the sea of people. Kill them all, the Emperor calmly ordered. It was as if he was narrating a common family matter. Just like this, he confidently and coldly decided on the life and death of the young warriors who had just escaped the royal palace. Then, he accepted a brand new, clean dragon robe from the hands of eunuch Yao, who had just arrived at the door of the palace, and began to change. The shadow retreated the fastest. He grabbed the half-unconscious Fan Xian from the snowy ground. With a muffled grunt, he forced down the mouthful of fresh blood that had welled up in his body. Like a bird, he floated strangely in the direction of the palace doors. Behind him, 13th Wang followed in a strange posture. Haidang Duo, who had already taken off her patterned jacket and was wearing a plain robe, followed at the back with a calm expression. All 4 of them had suffered light or heavy injuries. Climbing over the palace walls had become a difficult task. They could only charge toward the palace doors. Everyone knew that the palace doors facing Taiji Palace were the most heavily guarded in the entire royal palace. However, the shadow coldly charged through without a glimmer of hesitation. This was not because of Fan Xian's orders. Rather, it was because he was a person of Dongyi and knew what the sword hut had the most. The trump card the Northern Chi people had used earlier was the giant city-guarding crossbow in one of the corner towers of the royal palace. When that muffled sound rang out, the imperial soldiers and guards in the royal palace finally knew that assassins had come to the royal palace. However, the fight to the death in the snow outside Taiji Palace had started and ended too quickly. When the figures of the 4 warriors charged toward the palace doors, a portion of the aces in the imperial army were heading toward the corner tower of the royal palace. The imperial soldiers left at the palace doors had only just finished organizing their formation like a large net. However, the moment this net was formed, it was torn apart by the sword light that soared into the sky. For sharp sword lights that soared into the sky appeared out of nowhere, causing the imperial army at the palace gate to fall into chaos. Broken limbs flew everywhere, fresh blood splattered, and miserable cries rang out. Of the 13 disciples of Dongyi's sword hut, other than the people Fan Xian had sent to Jiangnan to protect Su Wenmao and Xia Qifei, and a few people left in Dongyi to stabilize the army, there were 4 ninth-level swordsmen. No one knew how these ninth-level swordsmen had secretly sneaked into the royal palace. Everyone knew that the disciples of the sword hut shocked the world with their killing intent. Other than the 6th Bureau, which was controlled by the Overwatch Council Shadow, no power in the world could resist them when they carried out assassinations. In just an instant, the imperial soldiers who could not react in time were killed in the chaos. The heavy palace doors were also pulled open a crack. Amidst the angry howls of the imperial army generals and guards on duty, the 4 disciples of the sword hut coldly took control of the long and serene path of the palace doors and forcefully carved out a small space. Like wisps of ghosts, they flashed out of the crack in the palace doors and ran toward the vast and cold square in front of the royal palace. Fan Xian had received the emperor's finger. His index finger had been completely shattered. His body had been invaded by the valiant, tyrannical Jinchi. If the meridians in his body were not different from those of normal people, and he had cultivated Jinchi of the same nature as the Qing emperor, his entire body would probably have exploded under that mountain-like finger. But even though he had survived, he still felt that his meridians had already broken into countless places. Inside and outside of his body, it was as if there were countless red-hot, thin iron wires swimming inside his body. His mind was buzzing, and that kind of unbearable pain pierced into his brain. The instinct of humans to protect themselves made it extremely easy for him to faint under this kind of intense pain. However, Fan Xian could not faint because he knew he had not escaped the royal palace alive. His blurry vision had long seen the clear and ruthless sword intense released by the disciples of the sword hut. His brows furrowed in pain. He had not arranged for these disciples of the sword hut to come. He had not thought of dragging the sword hut into this muddy water. The Shadow was an old official of the Overwatch Council. Hai Tang was his woman, and 13th Wang was his friend. The 3 people who had entered the palace to assassinate were all people Fan Xian had personal connections with. After all, this was a gentleman's battle with the emperor. It was easy to guess that the emperor could tolerate Fan Xian finding these people to help. However, if Fan Xian used the power of Dongyi or even Northern Qi, this matter would probably become even more troublesome. Even more troublesome was the silence outside the palace. The square in front of the royal palace, shrouded in white snow, was so quiet it was as if there was not a single person there. When the 4 disciples of the sword hut also turned into shadows and escorted Fan Xian and the others onto the snowy ground outside the royal palace with their swords, it was as if only the sound of their footsteps could be heard in the entire world. It appeared very quiet. This kind of death-like silence was too strange. Anyone would know that there was a problem. Although Fan Xian had no intention of using the disciples of the sword hut, the path he had arranged to leave the palace was the same as the Shadow's choice. It was also the front gate of the royal palace that no one would have thought of. The reason he had chosen the front gate was because Fan Xian had predicted beforehand that when he entered the palace to negotiate with the emperor, the matter of him poisoning his own way to death would have already exploded in Jingdou. The civil officials would certainly come to beg for mercy, and the stubborn imperial censors would kneel in the snow and exert endless pressure on the emperor. This had already been confirmed by Eunuch Yao's report last night. When Fan Xian and his group escaped from the front gate of the royal palace, they should have seen a ground full of officials with faces full of grief and indignation. They should have heard the clamorous sounds of discussion. The white snow had already been trampled into mud, and the servants and servants of each manor were hiding in carriages in the distant streets and alleys. The group of people who had escaped could take advantage of the chaos to escape. Fan Xian had even thought of a way to steal the carriages of each manor. However, there was nothing, only a vast expanse of white. It was so clean that the only thing they could see were the footprints and faint shadows they left in the snow. The only thing they could hear was their own heavy breathing. Everyone noticed that something was amiss. The palace gate at the back slowly closed again. Surprisingly, the imperial guards inside did not come out in pursuit. However, Shadow's face was still cold as he flew forward. He knew that something was wrong and that this might be a trap, but what else could they do? Apart from rushing over. The square in front of the royal palace was grand and spacious. During the military parade, it had once held 100,000 people. 3 years ago, during the Jingdou Rebellion, the Qin and Yi families had led armies to surround the palace. Tens of thousands of soldiers had also gathered there. But today, on top of the thick snow, only this group of people who had fought their way out of the imperial palace could be seen. They looked so lonely and pitiful. From the right side of this lonely group came a series of soft noises. The sporadic fighting at the corner tower of the royal palace seemed to have ended. The spies and assassins the northern Qi had planted in the Qing kingdom for the longest time had probably been swept clean by the imperial soldiers. At this moment, two figures fell from the vermilion palace wall at the corner tower. The royal palace was very tall. The speed at which the two figures fell was very fast. It looked like they were about to fall into the snow and die with their bones broken. Unexpectedly, there was an explosive roar in the air. A curved knife flew out from the waist of a figure. It appeared to be messy, but it was actually cleverly chopping. Each time the knife chopped down, it left a deep mark on the newly repaired vermilion palace wall. That person used a pair of curved knives and was very powerful. He was able to maintain his figure in the air. The other person's cultivation was clearly weaker. He could only use the sword in his hand to stab into the chain of his companion's knife hilt. In just a few moments, the two figures fell heavily to the bottom of the palace wall. The tall and sturdy warrior was not injured. Grabbing his companion, he ran toward the center of the snowy ground. Looking at their direction, it seemed that they were going to meet up with Fan Xian's group. These two people were one of the few remaining 9th-level aces in northern Qi. One of them was Master Ku He's last disciple, the foremost ace in the northern Qi royal palace, Lang Tiao. The other was Friar He. Fan Xian's group had already reached the center of the vast, snowy ground. Suddenly, they discovered that a strange companion had suddenly appeared. They couldn't help but be startled. In order to cooperate with Fan Xian's actions, the Northern Qi Emperor was willing to have his two most powerful generals infiltrate the Qing kingdom. It could truly be said that he had put down a lot of capital. However, Sir Lang Tiao had just entered Jingdo and had no time to display his true abilities. He only had time to cooperate with the spy hidden in the palace and use the city-guarding crossbow to fire off a strike. He could only watch as the assassination in front of Taiji Palace began and ended. A hero's spirit was short. Lang Tiao, with his pure cultivation, was not even able to bring his knife down on the Qing Emperor before he was forced by the imperial soldiers to flee from the royal palace. Friar He, who was beside him, was injured in the foot and could only be carried by him. Don't run anymore. Fan Xian, who had been carried by the shadow the entire time, looked at Lang Tiao, who was gradually about to meet up with him. His pupils constricted slightly. Not only was he shocked, but he also felt an absurd anger. Why did the people of the world always think that they could cooperate with everything they wanted to happen? Regardless of whether it was the appearance of the disciples of the Sword Hut or Lang Tiao, they both chilled Fan Xian's heart. He had arranged for so long and plotted for so long. At this moment, he had suddenly lost his foundation. He couldn't help but feel sorrowful. What made Fan Xian feel even more sorrowful was the silence of the square. A group of people had gathered on the snowy ground in the center of the square. It was not far from the private residences in front of them. It was very close to the T-junction in front of them. However, everyone knew that unknown dangers were waiting for them in those places. Fan Xian had once again lost to the Emperor and suffered a crushing defeat. The appearance of the disciples of the Sword Hut and Lang Tiao, the two northern Qi people, made it so that he didn't even have an excuse to save his life. He didn't know that the Emperor had already given the order to kill him in the palace. He didn't know that his mental battle would not succeed. A faint tiredness rose through his eyes. The shadows silently stopped walking. In the wind and snow, Haitang wiped away the blood at the corner of her lips and smiled slightly. She walked to Fan Xian's side, who was sitting in the snow. Crouching down, she tilted her head and said, "I said a long time ago that for you to be so hesitant, wanting to go along with your brother's feelings and not go against your wife's wishes, is truly a very childish way of thinking. I just want fewer people to die. In the end, this is a private matter." Fan Xian forced a smile. Sitting in the snow, he felt the coldness from under his butt. If I was extremely shameless, there would still be tens of thousands of people worshipping me. However, I can't do it. Otherwise, how could I have caused such a scene in the palace today? 13th Wang dragged his bloody arm and walked to his side. In a raspy voice, he said, "At least you tried. Although you lost, it wasn't bad." Fan Xian spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the snowy ground beside him. Gasping for breath, he said, "But I am truly afraid of death." Although he said this, a rarely seen light of peace and happiness rose in his eyes. "Looks like you don't like my arrival." Lang Tiao walked to Fan Xian's side and calmly said, "It is just that your personal grudge is also our personal grudge, so my arrival has nothing to do with you. Of course, I have to admit that this is the first time I have discovered that killing people has little to do with martial cultivation. In this matter, I appear to be somewhat useless." Lang Qiao glanced at his junior disciple's sister, Haidang Duo. He then furrowed his brows at Fan Xian and said, "If Duo had been willing to tell me your plan, perhaps today's ending would have been different." "Oh, perhaps the ending was predetermined long ago. One has to believe in fate. However, if you can carry me out in a moment, I won't say you're useless," Fan Xian said as he looked at Lang Tiao and smiled wretchedly, baring his teeth. In this vast expanse of white and incomparably quiet snow, this group of assassins, which had gathered the most elite warriors in the world, began to casually chat in the center of the snowy ground. It seemed that no one thought about who would be able to escape once the Qing Kingdom's powerful and terrifying national machinery began to surround and kill them. The countless imperial soldiers on the palace walls turned into layers of black lines. Bows and arrows in their hands, they stared coldly at the assassins in the snow below the palace walls, ready to fire at any moment. Gong Jian narrowed his eyes and stood in the center. Looking at the people in the snow, his heart felt heavy. He didn't know how Sir Fan Jr. could still smile at a time like this. While Fan Xian and the others were talking, the situation in the square in front of the palace walls had long changed. Countless crossbows and arrows poked out from between the seemingly normal private residences. The shining arrows were like a dense mass of killing grass, aimed at the group of people in the center of the snowy ground. At the closest T-junction, the sound of horse hooves rang out like thunder. Over 2,000 elite riders in metal armor firmly sealed off the area, not leaving any path that could be used. Who could survive in the direction of tens of thousands of arrows? How could the physical body block the charge of the metal cavalry? Everything seemed to have reached a dead end. There were no more variables that could change all of this and delay the arrival of the god of death. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the mighty riders of the T-junction. He looked at Yi Zhong, who was personally leading the troops in front of the riders. He looked at the terrifying arrow tips on the second story of the private residences. He looked at the dozens of people walking out of the residences and gradually approaching the center of the snowy ground. The dozens of ascetic monks wearing straw hats and looking incomparably cold but inwardly fanatical. He finally couldn't resist letting out a sigh. Back then, it had been his plan that the great prince's purge of the imperial army had begun in those private residences. The Overwatch Council had cooperated with the Black Knights to follow Zhengyang Gate all the way to the T-junction. They had forcefully cut the rebel army cavalry in half and nailed Qin Hung alive in front of the palace walls, ending the old Qin family line. Now, the emperor's plan was just like what he had done 3 years ago. He had blocked off any path of survival for himself. It was truly like history was repeating itself. He didn't know if there was something called retribution in the dark, besieging the enemy to attack the reinforcements, luring the enemy out of the cage, and sweeping away all the power that dared to oppose him in one fell swoop. This was the method the emperor had long used. However, with the jewel of Dong Mountain in front of him, what did this kind of battle count for? No matter how used it was, with the support of the Qing Kingdom's powerful power, no one could break the emperor's plan. There really is nothing new. Fan Xian's eyes were a little unfocused as he mumbled something indistinctly through the blood. Then, his head simply tilted to the side, and he fainted in Haitang Duoduo's arms. He had fought a number of battles with the Qing emperor. In the end, he had forced out the sword qi at the tip of his finger, but he was still no match for the emperor's supreme qi. He had been tragically defeated by one finger. The exhaustion of his Jinshi had long reached the end of his life. For him to be able to endure until now, before fainting, was already a remarkable feat. The sound of footsteps around the square rang out slowly and steadily. The sound of horse hooves did not slow down. Countless Qing elite soldiers pressed closer from all sides of the square. Gradually, the center of the snowy ground was within range of the arrows. The dozens of ascetic monks wearing straw hats stood in front of the army and looked coldly at these people. If the attack of the long arrows could not completely destroy the assassins, it would be time for the Iron Knights and ascetic monks to take the field. Other than Lang Tiao and the 4 warriors from the Sword Hut, no one else was unharmed. Faced with the suppression of such a powerful martial force, everyone knew it was impossible for them to escape. However, they had already entered the 9th level. Other than Fan Xian, these people had long become indifferent to life and death. No one showed a glimmer of fear on their faces. Lang Tiao and the 4 warriors from the Sword Hut met each other's eyes. They each knew what they should do and gently nodded their heads. Then, the foremost ace in the northern Qi royal palace turned his head to glance at Haitang Duo with pity. He found that there was no sorrow of parting on her face. She only held Fan Xian quietly with a slight smile. Lang Tiao also smiled. Looking at Fan Xian in Haitang's arms, he shook his head and sighed in admiration. At this time, he fainted so straightforwardly. How can one not respect him? Having changed into a clean dragon robe, the emperor walked silently up the stone steps of the palace walls. The imperial soldiers he passed all half-knelt in a military salute. No one dared to look directly at the bright yellow color. Eunuch Yao followed closely at the emperor's side. Suddenly, he heard the emperor ask in a low voice, "Why haven't they moved?" This. Eunuch Yao's heart thumped. He didn't know how to respond. He knew that the emperor already hated Sir Fan Jr. He also knew that the emperor had doted on Sir Fan Jr. to the bone, particularly after the death of the second prince. Everyone in the palace knew how much the emperor cherished Sir Fan Jr. If he had ordered tens of thousands of arrows to be fired and Sir Fan Jr. had died in the chaos, he wouldn't know how to explain it to the emperor. Eunuch Yao felt fear at the emperor's personal visit to the palace walls. If it was only to kill the assassins outside the palace, the emperor's arrangements were more than enough. Why did he have to personally come and see? He was probably still reluctant in his heart. I want to personally see that unfilial son die in front of me. Perhaps the emperor saw what Eunuch Yao was thinking. Coldly, he said, "Fire the arrows." With a glance from the emperor, a promise could not be taken back. With the order, the arrows were released. While the emperor was still walking on the wide stone steps to the palace walls, the arrows in the hands of the soldiers around the square were released. Densely packed, the tens of thousands of arrows whistled through the wind. Like insects, they covered the sky and covered the sun. They shot directly toward the snowy ground in the center of the square. If Fan Xian's body was in perfect condition, perhaps he could have used the heart he had just comprehended to move dozens of feet in a straight line and dodge this dense rain of arrows. However, he had already fainted. No one in the world could dodge a rain of arrows. In the instant before the Qing soldiers fired, Lang Tiao let out an explosive roar. A severe light flashed in his eyes. He grabbed Fan Xian's body from Haitang's arms and grabbed the metal chain between the 2 curved knives with one hand. He swung the 2 curved knives into an impenetrable blade light and charged valiantly toward the ascetic monks closest to him. The Qing emperor slowly stepped onto the palace walls. His bright yellow dragon robe was intimidating. His hands were held behind his back and were unusually steady. There was not a trace of trembling. His eyes were slightly sunken and unusually cold. There was not a trace of emotion. He looked at the blood-red color on the snowy ground in front of the palace walls and the arrows scattered on the ground. His expression did not change at all. His gaze shifted slightly. He then saw Fan Xian, who was protected by everyone and whose life or death was unknown. His brows furrowed slightly. A dense rain of arrows fell. The 4 warriors of the Sword Hut stood guard in 4 directions. Relying on their powerful 9th-level cultivation, They formed a net of swords, protecting everyone else within it. No one knew how many arrows they had broken. However, there was a limit to one's strength. This was different from when Great Master Sanshur was shot to death outside Jingdo. In Jingdo, there were tens of thousands of arrows falling like rain. Who could not be wet and who could not die? After the rain of arrows, the 4 warriors of the Sword Hut had already been hit by a number of arrows. However, they still stood valiantly in 4 directions. Fresh blood flowed from their bodies. No one knew if these disciples, who had inherited Sigu Jian's ruthlessness and ruthlessness, would fall in the next moment. At the edge of the net of swords, Friar he had already been shot until he looked like a porcupine. He could not be more dead. In the past, this Northern Chi 9th level ace had been so impressive. Now, in front of the powerful power of the Empire, he could not withstand a single blow. No matter how powerful a person was, in front of a flourishing dynasty, they were still as helpless as an ant unless the person was so powerful that they were inhumanly powerful, such as a great grandmaster. The rain of arrows stopped. Lang Qiao, covered in blood, also retreated. Earlier, he had intended to protect Fan Xian as he charged out. In the end, he was unable to break through the dense rain of arrows. After the 2 soul-eating curved knives killed 2 ascetic monks, they could only retreat. There were still 2 bone-deep arrows stuck in his right shoulder. Fresh blood flowed down. Haitang glanced at him. Lang Tiao did not turn around. Silently, he said, "The Emperor has orders that he must be kept alive." Everyone was either injured or dead. Although they were all powerful warriors who could dominate a region, from the beginning, they were unable to band together and bravely break out of the encirclement. Looking at the Qing court's battle array, from the beginning, they had not given them any chance of survival. The Emperor calmly looked at the bloody scene below the palace walls. After a moment of silence, he quietly said, "Continue." The moment the assassination in Taiji Palace ended, the Emperor finally felt relieved. The invisible shackles weighing down on his body had been released. Thus, he recovered his usual confidence and calm elegance and methodically began to arrange everything. After Dong Mountain, or more accurately, after the incident in Taiping Courtyard 20 years ago, what the great Qing Emperor feared the most in this world was the youth covered in black cloth and the chest that had disappeared. In Taiji Palace, the Qing Emperor had already forced Fan Xian to a dead end, but the chest still did not appear. Wu Zhu still did not appear. The Qing Emperor's last caution finally disappeared without a trace. He could finally be sure that the chest was not on Fan Xian's body, at least not right now. As for the 5th prince, presumably, he was trapped in the temple and would never be able to come out. The Emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the warriors struggling on the verge of death below the palace walls. There were no large ripples in his heart. Just as Fan Xian had thought earlier, it was like this on Dong Mountain, much less these 9th-level minor figures. There was not a sliver of pride in the Emperor's heart. Such a small matter could not make him proud. He only looked calmly at Fan Xian, whose life or death was unknown, from a distance. A faint sense of exhaustion rose in his heart. Following the military order from the palace walls, the Qing elites surrounding the square once again raised the longbows in their hands. The steady arrows once again aimed at the warriors covered in blood in the snow. They didn't know what kind of extraordinary figures these assassins were. They only knew that as long as they released the arrows in their hands, no matter how powerful the assassins were, only death awaited them. Perhaps some military generals or clever soldiers guessed Sir Fan Jr.'s existence and saw him. Their hearts trembled slightly because Fan Xian's existence in the Qing kingdom had always been a kind of legend. However, this legend was about to be personally killed. As long as one was a Qing person, they would probably be shaken. Just like Yi Zhong at the T-junction, Shi Fei behind the archers, and Gong Jian on the palace walls, these 3 major figures of the Qing military all felt a faint sense of sorrow in their hearts. However, it was difficult to disobey a monarch's order or a military order. All of the soldiers still raised the longbows in their hands and aimed in that direction. The Emperor's eyes narrowed even more. However, the emperor did not notice. No one noticed that on the roof of Jiaxing Tower, some distance away from the square, there was also a person aiming at him on the palace walls. Jiaxing Tower was the third tallest building in Jingdao. It was originally an old place the Tianwan official used to observe the stars. Later, the young lady of the Yi family entered the capital and rebuilt a stargazing platform on the mountain outside Jingdao. Thus, Jiaxing Tower gradually fell into disuse. Other than the servants who cleaned daily, no one paid attention to this place. In the cold snow of the first month of the 12th year of the Qin calendar, there was a thin and small person crawling on the roof of Jiaxing Tower. A large and expensive white fur coat covered his body. Together with the white snow on the surrounding roofs, it hid the color of the green manservant clothes he wore. This person hid very well. Under the cover of the wind and snow, he seemed to blend into the snow-covered roof of Jiaxing Tower. In front of the expensive white fur coat, a cold metal pipe-shaped object extended out. It was the heavy sniper rifle that had killed Yin Xiaoyi on the meadow. The person under the white fur coat gently exhaled a breath of hot air and warmed his frozen and stiff palms. He once again refocused his eyes on the optical sight. He adjusted his breathing and used Jinqi to recover his nervous heartbeat. He fixed the sight in the sight on the palace walls and the emperor's body. The royal palace was far away, but the emperor was right in front of him. He was very familiar with this feeling. He was also very used to this kind of environment. The snow in the Tsang Mountains at night was actually a bit harder to endure than the snow in Jingdao. The muzzle of the gun under the fur coat moved slightly. After completing the last adjustment, the fingers steadily touched the cold metal. It did not tremble at all. It paused for a moment and then gently moved. Chapter 739. Separated by the fake mountain, Yin Bingyun looked at Fan Xian behind the mossy and snowy door. There was no expression on his face, but no one knew what he was thinking. After a moment of silence, he coldly said, "You know too many things. Don't forget, I have been at your side for so many years. I know a little about matters of the palace treasury. Furthermore, these years, you have always shifted your focus toward northern Qi. Fan Xizha is still in Shangjing. If you say you never had plans to betray the court and move to northern Qi, how can I believe that?" Fan Xian coughed gently and forced a smile. "I'm also a person of the Qin kingdom. Furthermore, I have an agreement with the emperor. If the emperor survives this time and does not carry out a purge of my people, I will not shed all pretense of cordiality with the court and stand on the side of the northern Qi people. Don't worry about this. This matter concerns the life and death of millions of people. How can I be at ease?" Yin Bingyun's voice was very low, and he scolded angrily. "I don't care what strange agreement you have with the emperor. If the situation changes in the future and you leave the Qin kingdom alive and go to Shangjing, who knows whether or not you will go crazy from anger and do those disgusting things." "Disgusting? Are you talking about selling the secrets of the palace treasury to northern Qi, or helping the Qi people attack the Qin kingdom southward?" Fan Xian smiled slightly mockingly. "One has to keep some promises in one's life. As long as the emperor keeps his promise, none of this will happen. You should know that the assassination attempt in the palace this time is only a small-scale battle. I have not used all of my killing weapons. As long as I am alive, the emperor must be forced to accept the agreement between me and him last night." Fan Xian's eyes became icy. He doesn't want the world to fall into chaos, so he cannot act against my people. No matter how angry he is, for the sake of his great cause, he must endure. Don't forget, those people are also people you are familiar with. They were once your companions, your friends, and your colleagues. If you kill me now, the power in my hands will no longer have a leader. To put it bluntly, without a leader, the emperor can slowly cut them with a soft knife. Do you want those people you were once familiar with to fall one by one under the emperor's butcher knife?" Fan Xian stared into Yin Bingyun's eyes and enunciated each word clearly. Yin Bingyun was silent for a moment and then replied, "It seems you have thought about this matter for a long time. You must know that there can only be one emperor in the sky and one emperor in the world. If you are alive, Even if you endure silently and do nothing, the Qin court's superficial balance will still be split in two by you. For the Qin kingdom, this is not a good thing. I just want the people I want to protect to live. For this goal, I have to live. In the future, I will stand on a high hill far away and coldly look at His Majesty and you in the palace. I think it will make you be on your guard. But don't forget, if you die, the officials and subordinates in the council will one day have to accept this reality. The emperor has great talent and strategy. He will certainly have a way to take back the Overwatch Council and even your Jiang and subordinates. Yin Bingyun stared into his eyes and said, "On the surface, you want to protect their lives, but in reality? In reality, you're only using the power of these people to threaten the emperor and the court. You insist on not dying because you're using the Overwatch Council as a personal weapon to continue your own intentions. You're actually just using the power of these people to threaten the emperor and the court. You insist on not dying because you're using the Overwatch Council as a private weapon to continue your own intentions. Both the Dean and you have said it before." Yin Bingyun's face was calm. "The Overwatch Council is a public tool, not a private tool. How can you use the public tool of a country for your own personal gain?" Yin Bingyun's face was calm. "The Overwatch Council is a public weapon, not a private weapon. How can you use the public weapon of a country for your own personal gain? This is where I disagree with you." "Is that so?" A slight coldness appeared in Fan Xian's eyes. Coldly and mockingly, he said, "The Overwatch Council is a public weapon. I cannot use it privately." "Then, why didn't you stand out bravely and rebuke the emperor when he used the Overwatch Council for his own gain?" These words directly struck Yin Bingyun's heart. He stared at Fan Xian in a daze, unable to digest these words. In the hearts of all the officials in the world, the emperor was the court, the Qin kingdom, and the public. The Overwatch Council was a public weapon, so it was the knife in the emperor's hand. Don't forget what you said. The Overwatch Council is a public weapon, not the emperor's private weapon. In the end, the person on the throne is only one person. Don't use him to represent the will of the world. Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyun coldly. Since it is a public weapon, it should belong to the virtuous. Yes, I am not a virtuous person, but do you dare to say that the emperor is also a virtuous person? Since he and I are only a pair of bastards, old and young, then it is very simple who the Overwatch Council belongs to." Fan Xian no longer looked at Yin Bingyun's expression. He picked up the canteen and took a sip with difficulty. Coldly, he said, "This council was set up by Yi Qingmei and left to me by Qin Pingping. What right does the emperor have to take it? What right do you have to say such senseless things to me? The Overwatch Council is an organization used to monitor the emperor. If it becomes the emperor's secret organization, you might as well not be the director of the Overwatch Council." He put down the canteen and reprimanded in a disdainful and bored tone. There was a death-like silence. Waves of shock rose in Yin Bingyun's heart. He had always thought that Fan Xian was only grieving over Chun Pingping's death, so he had bravely stood against the emperor. He had not thought that in Fan Xian's heart there was no innate dignity of imperial power. This kind of treasonous and rebellious argument was difficult for Sir Yin Jr. to digest. He was silent for a long time, but still could not wrap his head around it. Director Chun had never taught him this, and Fan Xian had never said this before. The Overwatch Council was used to monitor the emperor? What kind of joke was this? Glancing lightly at Yin Bingyun's expression out of the corner of his eye, a powerful sense of disappointment flashed through Fan Xian's heart. He knew that in this world, other than Chun Pingping, who had been deeply influenced by his mother and himself, no one else could accept this. Even his father, far away in Danzhou, would probably find it difficult to accept this. It was only because of him that his father had gradually grown apart from the Qin court. Yin Bingyun raised his head and looked calmly at Fan Xian. He was about to make a decision. For the benefit of the Qin court and the goal he had fought for in his life, he could not allow Fan Xian to bring too many secrets and throw too much power into the arms of a foreign enemy. However, if he truly had to take action and send him into the palace, Yin Bingyun knew that Fan Xian would certainly die today. Fan Xian did not seem to be in a rush. He just waited for Yin Bingyun's decision. At this moment, a tired, old, and indifferent voice sounded in the shadow of the rockery. It's so late. What's there to talk about? What's so good about letting those old maids hear gossip? Yin Bingyun's body froze. He recognized that the speaker was his father. He turned around with unusual difficulty. The fists in his sleeves were clenched tightly. After a moment of silence, he knew that his father was reminding him of something. If others knew that Fan Xian was hiding in his manor, then he would have no choice but to kill him. His father had spoken at the moment he made his decision. Naturally, it was giving him the strongest warning. Without Yin Ruohai's help, how could Fan Xian, with his meridians in a mess after being heavily injured, hide in the secret room in the fake mountain? How could his body be bandaged? How could there be food and water by his side? Yin Bingyun knew that his father's seemingly warm and normal words were using his father-son relationship to threaten him. If he really decided to harm Fan Xian, then this family would probably be destroyed from now on. Fan Xian calmly looked at Yin Ruohai in the darkness. He looked at the old man of the fourth bureau and smiled with difficulty. In a low voice, he said, "Let's not talk about this. You can go back first." Following this, he said coldly to Yin Bingyun, "Naturally, you won't hear what I say. There are a few files I took from King Jing's manor in the first cabinet of the council. When you have time the next few days, go take a look." These words were spoken lightly. It was as if Fan Xian was certain that Yin Bingyun would not act against him. Yin Bingyun stood silently for a long time with his eyes tightly closed. Finally, he left the fake mountain and walked toward his own manor. His decision to leave quietly had probably destroyed some of the stubbornness in his heart. It made the figure of his back appear somewhat desolate. No one will come to the fake mountain. Don't worry. Yin Ruohai walked to the bottom of the fake mountain and smiled warmly. What you said about the council earlier was very true. I hope he can understand some of it. Fan Xian smiled slightly and replied, "How about you teach me by example and use your own head to protect my head? Everything is for the Qing kingdom. In the end, Yin Bingyun cannot bear to use your life and death to prove his creed. Since everything has a price, presumably he will slowly think it through." In all of Jingdo, other than the Yin father and son, no one knew of Fan Xian's whereabouts. The search for him in Jingdo continued like a raging fire. There was no let up at all. Countless streets, alleys, and private residences had been turned over. What the Qing court found strange was that Fan Xian, heavily injured and unable to move, had disappeared from people's sight like a wandering spirit. The Overwatch Council was also cooperating with the court's edict. They were carrying out intelligence work in various areas, but they had found nothing. This time, the main focus of the search was the military and internal court. The Overwatch Council was only cooperating, so their affairs were not very busy. The present director of the Overwatch Council, Yin Bingyun, was not as busy and nervous as Yi Zhong and Eunuch Yao, unable to sleep. On the contrary, the square and sinister building on Tiana Avenue had many more images of him reading seriously. That night, Yin Bingyun listened to Fan Xian's words and began to read seriously the letters and files hidden in the first room. He read seriously for 3 days and 3 nights before he finished. Only then did he know that these were the memorials and letters Yi Qingmei had written to the emperor. They systematically described many plans for the Qing kingdom's future. However, these plans were too daring. No, it should be said that they were treasonous. These poison-like words made Yin Bingyun feel his fingers holding the paper begin to burn. In his shock, he didn't look closely. He only picked the words about the origins of the Overwatch Council and read them seriously. Fan Ro wore a large snow-white robe and stood quietly in front of the secluded palace doors below the royal palace, waiting for the imperial army and guards to jointly examine the token to enter the palace. After Scholar, he was assassinated in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. The defenses of all the yamens in Jingdo had been tightened to a state of war. She knew that what truly terrified the court was the matter of the emperor being assassinated. However, this matter was still hidden within a certain range and had not spread among the people. Fan Rou had already personally ordered her to enter the palace after she woke up. The Imperial Academy of Medicine had personally gone to the Fan Manor to invite her. This was not only because Fan Rou's medical skills, which she had inherited from Qing Shan and Fei Jie, had reached a certain realm. More importantly, the serious injury the Emperor had suffered was not the internal injuries and sword marks left by the assassins. The most fatal injury was the metal shrapnel that had flown into the flesh of the Emperor's chest. Everyone knew that in the entire world, only the young lady of the Fan family knew this strange method of treatment called surgery. On the way here, Fan Rou had already learned of the current condition of the Emperor's body from the mouth of the royal doctor. Knowing that the Emperor had not died under her shot, Fan Rou did not know what kind of feeling she had in her heart. Strangely, she did not feel overly disappointed. She only felt a bit lost. She had lived in the palace for a full 5 months and stayed in the royal study for 5 months. It could even be said that she was the woman who had stayed by the Emperor's side the longest these years. She knew very well what kind of person the gradually aging Emperor was. More importantly, the way this Emperor treated Fan Rou was indeed different from others. Be careful after you enter the palace. If it is inconvenient for the Emperor and you want to stay in the palace for treatment, you have to send a message to the manor. King Jing's heir, Li Hongsheng, stood by Fan Rou's side and warned her in a quiet voice. There was worry that could not be hidden between his brows. Treating the Emperor's illness had always been a terrifying matter. What was even more terrifying was that the Emperor's injuries could not be separated from Fan Xian. Yet Fan Rou was Fan Xian's favorite sister. Thinking of how Fan Rou had been placed under house arrest in the palace a few months ago, Li Hongsheng felt a strong worry in his heart. Yes, Fan Rou smiled slightly. The indifference and frost on her face gradually melted. She lowered her head and bowed toward Hongsheng. She and the imperial doctor were led by the guards toward the royal palace. She had always known of Li Hongsheng's intentions and was deeply moved by it. Particularly these few days, the Fan Manor had been repeatedly searched. Regardless of whether it was Lin Wan-er's status as a princess or Fan Rou's position in the Emperor's heart, in the face of the great crimes Fan Xian had committed, they all became things that did not need to be mentioned. After returning from Shiliang Road, Li Hongsheng, who had taken up the position of deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, did not avoid suspicion at all. Bravely, he held down the fort in the Fan Manor and suppressed the wolf-like soldiers. Without Li Hongsheng, the days of the Fan Manor would probably be much more difficult. Walking through the quiet and cold palace gate, the sound of footsteps rang out quietly. Fan Rou lowered her head slightly. She felt that what her brother had said in the past was right. Life had always been a play, and it was often an absurd play. The Emperor had almost died to her spear, yet she was going to treat his injury. Up until the moment Fan Rou entered the palace, she still had not made up her mind on how to respond. She knew that the Emperor had already woken up. Fortunately, the Emperor had woken up and sent down an edict. Thus, the Fan Manor had not suffered a disaster. Given the crimes Fan Xian had committed, the entire Fan Manor would probably be taken into prison. At most, Lin Wan-er, Fan Rou, and the children would be brought into the palace. However, the Emperor had not sent down this edict. This made Fan Rou admire her sister-in-law's choice not to leave the capital that day. Although no one knew exactly what Fan Xian and the Emperor had said the night before the palace coup and what agreement they had reached, at least Lin Wan had guessed something. Presently, Jingdo was only desperately chasing after Fan Xian and did not use lightning speed to suppress the people Fan Xian protected. The Fan Manor not leaving the capital and returning to Danzhou was, without question, an expression of an attitude. It was an attitude to test how sincere the Emperor was in fulfilling his promise. Thinking of this, Fan Rou admired her sister-in-law's calm state of mind in the face of danger. She felt a sense of worship for her brother, Fan Xian, that had long been rooted in her heart. In this world, other than her brother, who else could force a powerful ruler to suppress his anger after being attacked by an assassin. The palace was right in front of her eyes. Fan Ruo gradually calmed her emotions. She had only been at Jiaxing Tower to help her brother escape Jingdo. When all was said and done, she could not feel too much hatred toward the emperor. After all, 20 years ago, the death of the pitiful infant she had never seen was too far away from her. On the last day of the first month, the steps of the 12th year of the Qing calendar finally landed firmly on this land. However, the footsteps of the Qing court still could not be steady. Although the emperor could already sit up and examine memorials, he could not exhaust himself too much. Ji Zhongwei of the Hall of Governmental Affairs had died, and key officials in various departments had been ruthlessly eliminated by Fan Xian. For a moment, the court was a bit chaotic. Fortunately, the scholar fought with his old life and did not return to his manor for 7 consecutive days and nights. At least, the important matters of court were not delayed too much. The footsteps in the shadows continued to step chaotically. Jingdo appeared to have returned to normal, but in reality, it was still under strict control. In particular, the work of capturing and killing those assassins never relaxed. The Qing court had to be proud of this matter. The 9th-level aces who had first been heavily injured by the emperor and then shot by tens of thousands of arrows should still be trapped in Jingdo, passing their days in fear. In such a large capital, they were able to strictly seal off the possibility of these aces escaping. One reason was because these aces were too heavily injured. Another reason was that one had to admit the terror of the Qing kingdom's national machinery. At present, the deaths of 5 assassins had been confirmed. Their bodies had already been transported into the royal palace. Of the known assassins, at least 3 were still missing. They were the foremost ace in the northern Qi royal palace, Sir Lang Qiao, the youngest disciple of Dongyi's sword hut, and northern Qi's saint girl, Haitang Duo. These 3 had almost been captured a few times in Jingdo. Each time, they had paid the price of blood before escaping wretchedly. As for Fan Xian, there was not even a shadow to be found. Yes, Fan Xian had disappeared, and the shadow had also disappeared. Only now did the Qing official responsible for the killing realize that the people the Overwatch Council had raised were indeed too talented in these areas. However, the officials still had confidence because Sir Fan Jr.'s injuries were too heavy. The emperor had said that his meridians had been destroyed and would not recover within a year. On the other side, the court officials who entered the palace every night to report on the progress and hand in memorials to the emperor couldn't help but see another scene that they had long gotten used to, but now found particularly strange. The emperor lay weakly in a pile of blankets. A woman wearing normal clothes served the emperor coldly and carefully, bringing him medicine and feeding him. The woman was the young lady of the Fan family. The court officials had long gotten used to seeing her appearance in the past 5 months. They had not expected that she would come back after only a day out. Hadn't Sir Fan Jr. become an imperial criminal who had tried to assassinate the emperor? How could his sister still serve at the emperor's side? What was Manager Yao thinking? Was he not worried that the young lady of the Fan family would do something bad? Not only was the young lady of the Fan family serving the emperor in the palace every day, but even the Fan Manor, which everyone saw as a place of death, did not seem to have become hell. The people inside lived as usual. Princess Chun, Lin Wan'er, would enter the palace every few days to bring the emperor some fresh food and joke with him. What was going on? The emperor was probably going crazy from wanting to kill Sir Fan Jr., but he did not want to make things difficult for his wife and sister. This scene was truly too preposterous and absurd, and it was truly difficult for others to understand. The depressing atmosphere in Jingdo was finally broken one day at the beginning of February. Eunuch Yao received a top-secret message. That night, after a long conversation with the injured and tired emperor in the royal study, countless internal court and military people quietly gathered from all directions the next day and came to the front door of Viscount Qinghai's manor. The moment the morning light rose, the green buds on the trees were still sleeping under the bark when the front door of the Yin Manor was suddenly blown open. Soldiers gathered from all directions and guarded all directions. Over 20 aces leaped over the high courtyard walls. They seemed to know where their target was and headed straight for the fake mountain in the back garden. Eunuch Yao held his hands at his sleeves and waited calmly outside the Yin Manor. He had no intention of entering the manor to speak. This manor was not a simple place. Putting aside how long Sir Yin Rawhai had operated in the Overwatch Council, the present young master of the Yin Manor was, after all, the director of the Overwatch Council. This operation had not leaked any information to the Overwatch Council. Once they actually captured the noble in the Yin Manor, Yin Bingyun would not be able to explain it no matter what. Sir Yin Jr. was wearing a nightgown. With a serious expression, he looked at the arrogant soldiers searching everywhere in the manor. The anger in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. However, his expression remained calm. The most successful spy in the Qin Kingdom had a strong will. It was not something normal people could compare to. He did not hurry toward his father's residence in the back of the garden. He just stood in the bedroom door and watched coldly as everything happened. On the bed behind him, his wife, Lady Shun, slowly sat up and asked in a trembling voice, "What happened? Do you not know what happened?" Yin Bingyun didn't even turn his head. His voice was squeezed into a cold line. Sitting on the bed, Shun Wan Er's expression changed drastically. A moment later, she replied in a trembling voice, "What did you say?" "Only my father and I know. You were the one who reminded me." A bitter smile rose to the corners of Yin Bingyun's lips. "Back then, I had indeed let you down. But it has been so many years. I thought you had long forgotten. Furthermore, we are husband and wife. I didn't think that you would still be unwilling to let the Yin family be destroyed." Shenwan Er's body began to tremble. She knew that her husband had already seen through what she had done. Facing Yin Bingyun's back, she said in a wretched voice, "How could I have such thoughts? However, he is, in the end, a criminal. If the court finds out, how can our family escape responsibility? Besides, he has always been a powerful person. If he said he hid in the manor and the manor didn't find him, the court would believe it. Yes, we have the merit of being the first, but we are also guilty of sheltering." Yin Bingyun's smile appeared dark, cold, and bitter. "I still don't understand. Why did you do this? You are a Northern Qi person. When did you become so loyal to the Qin court?" A clamor came from the courtyard of the Yin Manor, but the master's bedroom was very quiet. Behind Yin Bingyun, Shunwa lowered her head and was silent for a long time. Finally, she bravely raised her head. Her eyes were filled with hatred that could not be shaken off. "Why? What did you say? Don't forget, I am your wife." "Yes, that matter has nothing to do with you. But do you dare to say that it has nothing to do with Fan Xian?" Lady Shun's voice was not very loud, but appeared particularly sorrowful and hateful. She looked at Yin Bingyun's back and cried bitterly. "My father was killed by the Northern Qi Emperor's envoy, Shang Shanhu. Immediately after, my entire family was raided and destroyed. You have no idea what it means to destroy a family. My entire family of more than 200 people are all dead. My 3-year-old brother is also dead. Who did this? This was done by the Northern Qi Emperor, but do you really think I don't know that this was all the idea of Fan Xian and that woman called Haitang?" Lady Shun's eyes were filled with a hateful light. "But what could I do? Fan Xian is your superior, your friend, and the person you never say, but in reality admire the most. How could I expect you to avenge my family of over 200 people? Since he dared to escape to my side and let me discover him, I cannot miss this opportunity." After Lady Shun finished saying these words, she knew that no matter how things developed, it would be impossible to win back the heart of the man in front of her. Her entire body went limp as she sat on the bed. She couldn't help but be shocked. Why did a woman like her, who didn't understand anything, do such a daring thing driven by hatred? Yin Bingyun's body froze slightly, but he didn't have any reaction. He only sighed in his heart, feeling a bit lost. The fake mountain in the back garden had already been forcefully dug out by the soldiers. They looked at the dust-covered secret room inside, the space that no one seemed to have ever been in. They couldn't help but freeze where they stood. Yin Ruahai, who had been startled out of the room by the noise, acted as if he didn't know anything. He furrowed his brows and looked at the soldiers responsible for killing the criminals and the internal court aces. In a cold voice, he said, "What is going on? I've been hiding in the manor, but I've never worried that something would happen." In the carriage, Fan Xian leaned comfortably against the soft cushions. Although the meridians in his body were still a mess, and he was worse than a cripple, this could not affect his good mood. At least he was out of Jingdo. Looking at the more vivid scenery around Jingdo, he felt happy for some reason. When he left the Yin Manor, he didn't know what had happened. He also didn't know that Lady Shun had never forgotten the massacre of the Shen Manor in Shangjing in the 5th year of the Qin calendar. He trusted in old Sir Yan's abilities. The Yin father and son were both skilled figures in the Overwatch Council. How could they not have sensed the strange movements in their own manor? It was still the valiant power of the Yin Manor that had finally found an opportunity to send Fan Xian out of Jingdo. The carriage was traveling on the dimly lit road in the mountains. The driver was an official of the Overwatch Council, but he was not an old subordinate Fan Xian was familiar with. He was also not an old member of the Qinian unit. Since the Yin Manor was at ease in letting this official manage this matter, presumably, they had sufficient confidence in his loyalty. That's the dean's good fortune. Otherwise, the director would not have found such an opportunity to send you out of Jingdo. Of the two directors, the first was Fan Xian, and the second was Yin Bingyan. The official was silent for a moment, and then suddenly said, "The director wants me to ask you one last thing. You promised him not to go to Northern Qi and not to betray the court. Can you really do it?" "This damned lump of ice." Fan Xian scolded jokingly. "Since I've said it, I will do it. I'm not like the old cripple who has no inhibitions. After you return to the capital, help me give this letter to Yin Bingyun. Have him think of a way to deliver it to the emperor's desk," Fan Xian instructed after thinking for a moment. He then handed over a thin letter. The contents of the letter were simple. He had already left Jingdo and would fulfill the contents of the agreement he had made with the emperor that night. He also asked the emperor to keep his promise that the emperor would not go back on his word. He also wished the emperor good health and to take care. The main reason for this unnecessary action was because of his friends who were still sealed in Jingdo. Fan Xian knew that the emperor's main target was him. If he could escape Jingdo alive, then there was not much meaning in wasting the country's power, stirring up more discussion, and keeping 13th Wang and the others in Jingdo. The carriage made a few turns in the outskirts of Jingdo and made a few circles. Using the secret paths in the mountains as well as a few transfer points the Overwatch Council had prepared, it took a full 3 days to arrive outside a city in a neighboring province. The carriage would not enter the city. Instead, it chose to carry out the handover here. Looking at the familiar face, Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. "I feel much more at ease now that you're here." Wang Qinian, who had rushed back to the Qin kingdom from Shangjing in northern Qi and had been waiting outside Jingdo to receive him, had disguised himself as an old man. His face was full of wrinkles. Entering the carriage, he examined Fan Xian's injuries and couldn't help feeling heavy. He was not in a mood to joke and shook his head. "What do I have to disguise myself as?" Wang Qinian took out cosmetics and flowery clothes from his clothes. Forcing a smile, he said, "I have to disguise myself as my daughter-in-law." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He didn't make a pretentious gesture and accepted it. "It's much more convenient for you to disguise yourself as an old man than it is for me." While he was changing, Wang Qinian couldn't resist lowering his voice and asking, "Sir, from the beginning, did you already plan to be able to leave Jingdo?" "I'm not an immortal. Plans can't always keep up with changes." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "If I could win in the palace, I wouldn't have to leave the capital. Since I lost, I had to ensure my survival. Fortunately, my luck is as good as ever. I heard that it's not a place for humans to go, and not many people can go there. Those who dare to go there are all dead." "Who said they're all dead?" "Kuhi is alive. Shaon is also alive. Are my uncle and my mother all alive and well?" Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. It was as if he was searching for the backs of those people. In a quiet voice, he said, "Just surviving is not enough. This time, I still lost in Jingdo. Other than going to the temple to find my uncle, what other choice do I have? This is something I had thought about a long time ago. You don't have to stop me. Wang Qinyan's expression was a bit ugly. He muttered, "It's not that I want to stop you. Who in this world dares to stop you? Other than the emperor, those who dare to stop you are probably all dead. However, the temple is not the royal palace. It is a place where immortals live. I'm afraid that even if I took you and searched for decades, we wouldn't be able to find a place. Our goal is to not mess around." Fan Xian coughed and forcefully used his will to control the burning pain in his meridians. He forced a smile and said, "You don't have to be too afraid." This was something Fan Xian had thought about. He knew more about the illusory temple than anyone else in the world. He could even faintly capture the true background of the temple. Of course, this was all just a guess. His Majesty was so powerful that he had survived and woken up after the gunshot. Fan Xian knew that after this battle, the emperor would never personally leave the palace and risk his life again. The situation placed between Fan Xian and the emperor was a mutual restraint based on the long conversation the father and son had before they attacked. In the end, this was a battle between the two of them. Regardless of whether it was the Qing emperor or Fan Xian, neither wanted the flames of war to spread to the world. Thus, Fan Xian had suffered a crushing defeat. He had to find a power that could defeat the emperor. He could not find it in the world. He could only search in the sky. Fan Xian's mood was slightly heavy. He knew what a lofty existence the temple was in the hearts of the people. He was very worried about Wu Zhu's safety. For the sake of his meridians and many other goals, he had no choice but to make this dangerous trip to the temple. "Where do we go?" Wang Qinyan gently pulled on the reins and asked a very practical question. Everyone respected the temple, but no one knew where it was. "North. Keep going north. All the way north," Fan Xian said. "You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.